Officer Fox. I was rather hoping that I could help you get a few hundred kids the hell out of this particular ring of hell." Des and Trout stared at him. "What?" they asked in unison. "You said that you wanted to load the buses and take the kids somewhere safe? Well, if you could use 5 very well-armed bodyguards, consider us part of your team." Chapter 100. The Northern Levees, Fayette County. Jake DeGroot realized that he couldn't hide in a wet hole all night. They might find him. The soldiers and he had no word for the other things. Things like the girls, like his friends, like Burl. Just because they hadn't found him so far didn't mean they wouldn't. Or couldn't. He had no real idea what they could or couldn't do. He had to move, to get out of the hole. Before that. And before he froze to death. Jake knew that it wasn't really cold enough for that, but the water was cold enough to numb him. He remembered seeing something about hypothermia on an old episode of Survivor Man. His teeth chattered constantly. Shivers swept over him in waves, and he didn't like the way his heart was beating. No, he didn't like that one bit. He was a big man, and the last thing he needed now was a heart attack, or slow feet because his nerves were in some kind of shock. But leaving the pit, that was so scary. It made his balls want to climb up inside his body. It made him want to cry, or scream. Or go to sleep. That was the other problem. Between working hard all day yesterday and last night and then lying here for hours in the cold, he was getting weirdly drowsy. He kept nodding off and then jerking awake when his face fell into the water. "Gotta get out of here." He didn't know he was going to say it out loud until he'd said it. His voice sounded ridiculously loud and very strange. There was a sharp note of panic in his voice, a whine that was almost a sob. He didn't like that either. "I'm losing my shit here," he told himself, trying to make his voice sound normal and reasonable. It didn't. The rain was heavy, relentless. The ditch was so completely filled that the whole area was becoming a small lake. "You're gonna drown here, you dumb fuck." There was anger in his voice now. That was better. Better. Even so, it took Jake another 3 minutes to will his right arm to rise out of the water, not because it was so numb with cold, which it was, but because he was numb with terror. There was no light except what flashed across the sky, and all that showed him was water, mud, and the bodies left behind by the soldiers. Burl. "Move, goddammit. Move, 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 move." His right arm came up slowly, rising to the surface, then above it, and finally out toward the mud beyond the ditch. The rain immediately washed the mud from his hand, and when the next lightning flashed, he was horrified to see how pale he was. Blue-white, corpse-like, like one of them. "It's the cold, asshole," he told himself. "It's just the cold." He reached for higher ground at the edge of the pit, but his fingers sank into the mud and found nothing to hold. He tried again, and did nothing more than splash and stir the water in which he lay. "No," he said. And that note of panic was back in his voice, stronger and sharper than before. Jake tried it with both hands. Nothing. He tried to kick against the near edge of the ditch, but his feet sank to the ankles. It took real effort to pull his feet out again. The right one came first, plopping free of the mud, but as he pulled the left one out, he felt his shoe slide over the bulb of his heel. Then he heard the sound. Off to his right, on the other side of Big Bird, his yellow front-end loader. It was a splash. but it was too heavy to be rainwater. He froze and listened. Another splash, and another. Each one just a little louder and more distinct than the last, coming closer to where he wallowed in the mud. "Oh, Jesus!" At the sound of his voice, the sounds of splashing paused for one moment and then began again, faster this time, coming around the end of Big Bird, coming in his direction. He heard the other sound then. The moan. Jake almost screamed, knowing it for what it was. One of them. Stay or go. Stay or go. He was trapped inside a bubble of indecision for a terrible long moment. Then the splashes got even louder, and suddenly Jake was moving. His whole body thrashed and twisted like a beached dolphin. He pawed at the mud and kicked and wormed his way up the edge of the pit. Closer and closer. The moan louder, a single voice raised in a plaintive cry. Jake was halfway out of the pit when he saw it. It was a man, a stranger, dressed in a business suit, jacket torn, tie askew to expose a ravaged throat. For an awful moment their eyes met, the man in the mud and the thing in the rain. Then, with a cry like a wild animal, the creature rushed at him, hands outstretched. Jake screamed and tried to scramble away, got halfway to his feet, and then it was on him, slamming into him, knocking them both down so they slid back into the muddy pit under the front-end loader. It clawed at Jake, trying to grab him, trying to pull him toward teeth that snapped and clacked. Jake punched it, hitting the infected man in the face, in the throat, in the chest. But it was hard to find the balance and resistance to throw a solid punch. Jake was 6'8" and more than 300 pounds, and this man couldn't have been more than 200, but in the mud and water they were evenly matched. Except that the thing did not react to any of Jake's punches. Jake felt cartilage collapse beneath his knuckles as he hammered at its nose and throat. He felt bones crack in the face and temple and ribs, and he felt pain explode in his fingers and knuckles and wrists as the impacts took their toll while the struggle reawakened shocked nerve endings. But the thing kept fighting as if pain was not even connected to its existence. And maybe it wasn't. This thing was like Burl and those girls. It couldn't have been alive, not with the injuries it had, and yet it was fighting. It was a monster. A monster. He rammed his forearm under its chin and pressed the damned thing down into the mud. Inch by inch he pulled himself atop until finally he straddled it, pinning its arms down, battering its head deeper and deeper into the mud. "Die, you motherfucker!" he shouted, then choked on spit and snot and mud. Jake kept shoving it down, using his massive body to try and smother it, bury it. Mud filled its mouth. The bones of its throat crumbled to nothing. And yet, those hands kept flailing beneath Jake's shins. Buried in mud and drowned, battered to a wreck, it kept flailing. Jake sobbed with helpless terror. He fought a thing that could not be whipped, and his own understanding of the world began warping at the edges, pieces flying off it until everything seemed distorted and surreal. Something inside Jake's head broke. Not a bone, not anything physical. Something much deeper. Something in his mind was stretched to its farthest limit, could not stretch any further, and it snapped. The blackness became blacker still as his eyes filled with dark poppies that blossomed like fireworks. He heard a weird tearing sound in his ears and an animal growl that he could feel coming from his own throat. The growl turned into a roar as Jake reared back and tore the dead thing out of the mud, then grabbed its chin and a fistful of hair, and with more raw power than he had ever put into a single action ever in his life, he wrenched the head around. Bones exploded inside the savage throat, and still Jake turned. The body stopped struggling and still Jake turned. His mind began falling into a dark red well, and still Jake turned. And then he was pitching sideways, all resistance gone, the hair and chin locked inside his hands, but the creature's torso flopping the other way. Jake plunged into the waters, still holding the head. He lay there for a moment, and in that moment he heard, saw, felt, and tasted nothing. There was nothing, only a vast blackness. Then water seeped past the spasm in his throat, and he inhaled it. With a racking, aching, gargling cry, he came awake again. Lightning flashed, and its reflection lit the underside of the front-end loader's bucket. Jake saw what he held in his hands, and with a choking cry of disgust, he flung it away. And then he was scrambling again, thrashing his way out of the pit, away from the headless thing, away from the reality of what he had just done. The screams that made it through the coughs were high and shrill and inhuman. He got sloppily to his knees and tried to run, but gravity and balance were at war, and all he could manage was a sloppy lope on all fours. He fell, got up, fell again, and finally managed to get to his feet. And there he stood, wide-legged, wide-armed, letting the rain assault him as he screamed. Chapter 101. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. "Where the hell is General Zetter?" thundered the president. General Burroughs had a phone to his ear, but he said, "There's no technical problem, Mr. President. We pinged the lines and everything's working. However, no one is picking up." "Get some damn body on the phone," the president insisted. "I want to know what the hell is happening." Aides scrambled to call secondary contacts. "Sir! Sir!" yelled one. "I have one of the helicopter pilots on the line. Lieutenant Mills, putting the call on the speaker." "Oh, Christ! This hurts! Jesus!" "Lieutenant Mills," said the president loudly. "This is the president. I need you to give me a sit rep." "Sir? Sir?" The pilot's voice was filled with panic and pain. "Listen to me, son," said the president. "I need you to take a breath and tell me what is happening. Can you do that?" They heard the man take a long, hissing inhalation. Then, in a voice that was a fraction steadier, the pilot said, It's all falling apart." "Are you injured, son? Can you tell me that much?" "The bites. Damn, you never think they could hurt this bad." The president closed his eyes. "Son, do you know what happened to General Zetter?" There was a very long pause, filled only with rapid breathing that was close to hyperventilation. Then, in a substantially weaker voice, the pilot said, "He wasn't bitten. I'm sure about that. None of them were." "Who wasn't bitten?" "The general. Everyone in the command truck. I was with them. I was on the ground by then. We weren't anywhere near the fighting. Nobody was bitten. But, oh God, we thought he was sick, you know, from the dust cloud after we dropped the fuel air bombs. We thought it was just from breathing the ash, but damn it, nobody was bit. Not until it all went to shit. General Zetter, Captain Rice, all of them, they went apeshit. Oh, jeez, I think they clipped the artery. The tourniquet's not doing shit. Oh, God. Oh, God." "Where is General Zetter?" asked the president. But there was no answer. None at all. Which was too much answer for everyone in the Situation Room. Chapter 102. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Billy Trout was no damn use at all to anyone. He knew it, and everyone else knew it. Too much of him was bruised or strained, which meant he couldn't drag bodies and body parts out of the buses, and he couldn't work the janitor's power hose to wash away the black blood. It was gruesome work, and he was not sorry that he couldn't help. Instead, he set up his camera and began filming it. That and everything else. With the jamming off, he put together a new field report, explaining the facts as he knew it, with many of the blanks filled in by Sammy Mora. It surprised Trout how forthcoming Sam was, and he pulled him aside for a moment to ask about that. They stood by a window that looked down on the parking lot and the rows of big yellow school buses. "I've interviewed a lot of cops, soldiers, and federal types in the past," Trout said, "but I don't think I've ever had one actually spill the goods without either going off the record or prosecuting a personal agenda. In a nutshell, what gives?" Sam shook his head. "I come from a long line of realists. My dad's one. He's a cop in California, in a small town out near Yosemite. He was never the kind to pad the truth or get behind an official story. Dad believes that the truth is the truth. No one I ever met in Washington agrees. They can't," said Sam. "They're politicians, and politics is about leverage, not about the truth. Not sure I ever heard a politician ever give a straight answer to anything. Everything's agenda-based with them." "Okay, but you work for a bureaucrat." "Sure, but Scott Blair is a lot like my dad. He's not very well liked in D.C. because he always wants to cut to the bottom line." "He's the one who wanted the president to bomb us back to the Stone Age?" Sam met his eyes and nodded. "Yes, he was." "Nice. Tell me something, Billy. Considering what's happened and how things might be if POTUS followed Scott's recommendation, do you think he made a bad call? Or do you think the president was right to cave and send the bombers back to the barn?" "Oh, that's unfair. You're asking me to say whether it's right or wrong to kill 600 kids. Take fairness out of the equation. Look at it for exactly what it is, a problem of survival. Not of a few, but survival of the species. Take a step back and look at the real problem, the big picture, Billy, and tell me what we should have done." "First, tell me the absolute truth. Is it really that bad out there?" "Yes." Sam said it without hesitation. "Are we in danger of losing control of this whole thing?" Sam's face turned to stone. "Billy, we may have already lost control of this thing. The math is so bad. There are so many ways this can go bad on us, and almost no way that we can put this genie back into the bottle." "You're saying we've lost? Christ, Sam, is that what you're saying?" "I don't know. There are still some cards we can play, and the spread will hit some natural barriers, rivers, mountains, lakes, bridges. All of those are potential choke points, or they can act as fire breaks. Can we get ahead of it? I don't know. Not unless we up the game." "Up it from fuel air bombs? Shit, what's the next upgrade after that?" Sam said nothing. Billy looked down at his hands. "Oh, man." "So, again I ask you, Billy. Last night, what should we have done last night?" It hurt so much for Trout to say it, but he managed to get the words past the stricture in his throat. "You should have killed us." "Yes," said Sam. "We should have killed you. And God help my soul for saying and believing that." They sat in silence for a moment, each of them looking at the world through that lens. "Then why are you helping us now?" Billy asked again. Sam nodded to the buses down in the lot and the dozens of people scrambling to prepare them for an escape. "For me and my guys, it's like being cut off behind enemy lines. Sure, we could make it back to the front, but I have a feeling that this is going to change from a gunfight, which is what we do, to a war we're only going to be able to fight from the air, providing the storm ever stops. In a mechanized war, we're not much better than 5 extra sets of hands. It's a waste of our specialized skill sets." He gave Trout a rueful grin. And here? You kidding me? 600 kids, 200 civilians, and a horde of flesh-eating monsters? We might actually get to be bona fide heroes. And wouldn't that make a nice change? You're joking. Sam held up his thumb and forefinger an inch apart. Only a little. Down in the lot, the 4 members of the Boy Scouts were helping with the preparations. Trout had been introduced to them only by their combat call signs and what little he could deduce about their personalities. The woman, Gypsy, was a problem solver and apparently the second in command. Moonshiner was gruff and lacked obvious warmth, unlike Boxer, who seemed to wear his heart on his sleeve. Shortstop was the most detached of the bunch, very pragmatic but aloof. "What about your team?" asked Trout, nodding out the window. "Are they on the same page as you?" Sam nodded. "They usually are. We tend to think like a pack of—" He stopped speaking and leaned close to the window as lightning flashed and flashed again. The soldier's body went suddenly rigid with tension. Then he tapped his earbud. "Team alert, this is Ronan. I have eyes on the street beyond the north fence. We have potential hostiles. Repeat, potential hostiles." It was Boxer who turned first, snatching his rifle from where it lay under a jacket and out of the rain. He brought it up and snapped on the top-mounted light. The beam cut through the rain and the openings in the chain-link fence, and there, filling the street, were silent figures who moved with slow, implacable steps. "Give me numbers," ordered Sam. "Christ, boss, I got 40 of them. Shit, no, there's more coming." Gypsy's voice cut in. "We got more coming in from the west and—" Her words trailed away. Boxer turned, saw what she saw, and said what Sam and Trout were only now just beginning to see. "They're soldiers," said Boxer. "Oh, goddamn. It's the National Guard. They're all... Oh, shit. Gotta be 50 of them," said Moonshiner. Moonshiner popped a flare and sent it high into the air. There were not 50. There were hundreds of them. Torn, bleeding, shambling, and hungry. Chapter 103. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. The experts did one threat assessment after another, each time rebuilding both outbreak and response models to fit new data. With each new assessment, the president felt the world slip away from him. He sat in his chair, fingers balled into fists on the tabletop, staring at speaking mouths and screens filled with data. Scott Blair looked every bit as bad. He hung up from a call and rubbed his eyes. Or was he wiping at tears? The president couldn't tell. Blair held up a trembling hand, and the room fell into a flawed and troubled silence. "That was Dr. McCready. She's with the NBAC field team in Fayette County. They reached General Zetter's command post. It was deserted except for several infected. The infected were all members of the Guard command staff." "How the hell is that even possible?" demanded General Burroughs. "If they'd been overrun, we'd have known about it." "That's why Dr. McCready called. Her team was able to subdue and examine the infected at the command center. A few had been bitten, but most showed no signs of violence. No bites, nothing." "Then what in hell happened?" asked the president. Tears broke from the corners of Blair's eyes. "Dr. McCready thinks that the bombs reduced many of the infected to particulate matter and ash. Those particles still contain parasitic larvae, and the storm winds are spreading them throughout the region." There was a beat, and for a moment some of the people around the table seemed unable to comprehend the implications. The president wiped at his own tears. "Say the rest, Scott. Tell them." Blair placed his palms on the table and leaned heavily on them, his head hanging down between hunched shoulders. "Lucifer 113 has gone airborne," he said. Chapter 104. The Northern Levees, Fayette County. Jake DeGroot came back to himself slowly, so slowly, with pain and realization and horror. He stood in the rain and slowly looked around, trying to remember what world this was. 50 feet away, the yellow bulk of Big Bird stood like an anchor that held him to the world. He gasped and spat out the awful tastes in his mouth and wiped his face with the back of one big hand. His first clear and cogent thought was that this was not an isolated event. It couldn't be. The girls had been hurt. Killed? Was that the word? Somewhere else, and had walked onto the construction site. That meant whatever this was didn't start here. This wasn't some old Indian burial ground or any of that horror movie stuff. This was something else, and whatever it was happening out there. Out where exactly? The second thing he thought was that they knew about it. They. The government. Or at least the National Guard. Those were soldiers who shot Burl and the others. Soldiers. That meant that this thing was really damn big. "Oh, shit," he said. He listened to his voice. There should be panic there, that desperate whine, but it wasn't there. He sounded like himself, the way he should. It was the second thing that anchored Jake DeGroot. It helped him take a real breath. Think it through, he told himself, liking the sound of his voice. He didn't have much family in the area, only a niece, Jenny, who lived in Bordentown. He could go there. But no. Jenny was a single woman and a teacher. With the storm, the single teachers volunteered to work at the Regent's emergency shelter, the Stebbins Little School. The kids would have all been picked up, but the cops would have moved the old folks to the school, and some families from the flooded areas. The school had cots and food and a generator. That's where Jenny would be. And suddenly he was very afraid. Not for himself this time. Jake thought about Jenny. She was a tiny little thing. It took everything Jake had to stop that one guy. Jenny? She could never. Before Jake even realized he was doing it, he began running for his car, slapping his pockets for his car keys, and not finding them. They had been in his jeans pocket. He looked back at the pit under Big Bird. They must have fallen out, down in the water, down in the mud. Jake swallowed a lump the size of a fist. No fucking way. Even if he could work up the nerve to crawl down there where the dead man was, what were the chances he would find those keys in all that mud and water? After all that fighting and thrashing, his car was useless to him. Even if he knew how to hotwire it, there was no time and no tools. His heart started to sink, but then he raised his eyes, just a few feet, and stared at the big metal monster. Big Bird. No, he told himself. It was too clumsy, too slow, and the school was too far. Then he was running through the mud toward the machine. The key for Big Bird was still where he had left it, right in the ignition. He twisted it, and the big diesel engine roared to life with a growl so loud that it sounded like a dragon rousing from a troubled slumber. He pulled the door shut, sealing himself inside the plexiglass cab. He turned the heat to high, shifted hard, and began moving through the mud. The Cat's top blacktop speed was 40, and the mud cut that down to less than half. The school was 11 miles away, almost due south. "I'm coming, Jenny," he said aloud. and the fact of having a purpose, of having someone else to fight for, made his whole body feel as hard and powerful as the steel of the machine in which he rode. He did not hear the crunch as the left rear tire rolled over the corpse in the mud, nor when the right rolled across the nearly submerged body of Burl. Or if he did, Jake refused to allow himself to acknowledge it. "I'm coming, Jenny!" Chapter 105. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. "Everyone back to the school!" screamed Des, but the adults were already dropping hoses and running. She ran behind them, shoving the slower ones, chasing them all to safety. "Check the doors! Keep the kids away from the windows! Move! Move!" Moonshiner and Shortstop laid their rifles atop the front and rear hoods of a burned-out police car. Boxer climbed atop one of the buses, and Gypsy went into another one and pointed her gun out the window. Only Sam and Trout stood their ground. "We'd better get inside," warned Trout. But Sam didn't move. "There are so many of them," he said softly. Des ran back to join them, her Glock in a two-handed grip, face set and hard. "You want to fight them here?" she asked incredulously. "There are too many ways they can come at us." The dead were closing in. The nearest ones were 50 feet beyond the fence. "It's your house," said Sam. "It's your call." "There's more coming across the yards," called Boxer, pointing. They turned and saw more of the infected staggering through the lines of connected yards to the east. "Des," said Trout, taking her by the arm. "This is stupid. There are too many of them. Let's get inside." But Des pulled her arm free. "No." She turned to them. "Listen, Billy, Sam, we can reinforce the building and hole up, but for how long? The supplies we have won't last. Sam, can you guarantee that the army's coming back for us?" The answer was on Sam's face. "This is falling apart. I don't think anyone can make promises right now." "What are you saying?" asked Trout. "That we could be stuck here for weeks?" "Billy, I'm saying if this keeps going the way it's going, then no one will be coming for us." "Until when?" Sam shook his head. "We could lose this war." "War? It's an outbreak." Sam pointed to the dead soldiers who were approaching the fence. "Not anymore." Trout felt his blood turn to ice. He caught a look at Des, who looked horrified, but she was nodding to herself. "How long can your team hold them on the other side of the fence?" she breathed. "How much time can you buy us?" The soldier's mouth tightened. "How much time do you need?" "An hour," she said. "Maybe less." "To do what?" demanded Trout. "To do what we started out to do. Get all the supplies and everyone in the school onto the buses. And then what? We get the fuck out of here." "And go where?" "I don't know," she said. "Philly? New York?" "No," said Sam. "Go south. Go to Asheville." "North Carolina?" asked Des. "Why there?" "Because the storm is heading east. Roads will be bad and they'll be blocked, because everyone running from this will be going east. And we can't go west because when we pinged Goat Wyman's satellite phone, it was clear he was heading northwest, maybe to Pittsburgh. We should go south and get into the mountains." "Sure, but why Asheville?" asked Trout. "Why there specifically?" Sam hesitated for a moment. "There is a government installation there." "Since when?" Des asked skeptically. "I never heard of it." "You wouldn't have. It was built during the Cold War. The mountains there are honeycombed with miles and miles of labs, living quarters, the works." "That's just an urban legend," said Trout. "I read about that. It's not real." "It's real. In the event of a nuclear exchange, it was deemed a safe zone because it's outside of the prevailing drift patterns for likely nukes." "Hey!" called Gypsy. "Somebody out there want to make a fucking decision? We're going to be dancing with these things pretty soon." Sam touched Dez's sleeve. "It's there. Trust me." Des met his eyes, searching them for truth and trust. Then she nodded. "Okay." "Good," said Sam, looking relieved. "We'll hold them as long as we can. You better get your asses in gear. Hurry." Des spun and ran for the building. They could hear her shouting orders before she was even inside. Chapter 106. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. The president stood up slowly and walked the length of the room until he stood in front of the big screen. He stood, hands clasped behind his back, head bowed, appearing to stare into the middle distance. "Mr. President," said Scott Blair, "we're starting to get reports of random attacks in other places. Harrisburg, Gettysburg." "How?" asked Sylvia Ruddy. "How is that possible? None of the infected could walk those distances, and the winds can't have reached there yet." "Survivors," said Blair. "People in cars or trucks, either bitten or people who breathed in the ash. We know that some escaped the containment. We have to shut down the highways and the airports, trains and buses too. We need roadblocks. If we have to, we can blow the tunnels and bridges on the major highways." The president nodded, and phones were snatched up to make those calls. "Sir," said Ruddy, "I think we need to initiate the emergency broadcast network." Another nod. "I'll draft a speech to the nation," she said, and hurried out. After she was gone, the president turned slowly to face his tableful of generals. "Talk to me about nuclear alternatives," he said. Chapter 107. Bessemer Court, West Station Square Drive, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
"You said you need to connect to the net, right?"
asked Homer. Goat looked up from his laptop. He was cutting Homer's diatribes into video bites that would be short enough to be watched in their entirety. "Yes, I have several bits ready to go up on YouTube. Why?" Homer tapped the windshield, and Goat peered through the whisking wipers to see the words "Free Wi-Fi" glowing in blue neon on the front of a red brick building.
"How long's this gonna take?"
asked the killer. Goat hedged. "Video files are big," he said slowly. "Takes a while for them to upload, and—"
"You need both hands to do that shit?"
Goat immediately flinched back, pulling his hands back as far as he could get them from the murderous madman. But Homer laughed, a deep, creaking bray.
"I ain't gonna eat your hands, you dumb shit,"
he guffawed.
"Jesus, you're fucking hilarious sometimes."
Why did you ask?"
"'Cause I want to go inside for a minute, and I want you here when I get back."
"I don't—" Homer reached into the back seat and produced a coil of heavy, hairy twine. It was brown, and the spiky hairs made it look like a vast, coiled centipede.
"Took this out of that last place. Useful shit. Give me your left hand. Come on, give it here unless you want me to take it."
With great reluctance, Goat slowly extended his trembling hand. Homer caught his wrist with fingers that were as cold and damp as worms, but as strong as steel. He jerked Goat's arm toward the steering wheel and then began looping the hairy twine around wrist, steering column, and between the spokes of the wheel. He tied sophisticated knots in the twine, looped more twine, tied additional knots, and then pulled on the ends until the bulb of each knot was compressed into a tiny, rock-hard nugget.
"That ought to do her,"
he said, admiring his work. He gave Goat a friendly grin.
"You only need one hand to jerk off with, right, boy? You said about putting my story out there for people to see and hear. You do that while I go see some folks about something I need."
"What is it? What are you going to do? What is this place? Why are we here?" Homer's friendly grin became lupine.
"You ain't figured it out yet."
"Figured what out?"
"What I am."
"I know what you are. I understand what Dr. Volker did to you. I know about Lucifer 113.
I ain't talking about no zombie bullshit, boy. Try again."
Goat licked his lips. "I understand about the black eye and the red mouth. Is that what you mean?" The killer sat there for a long moment. his eyes flicking back and forth between Goat's as if looking for something first in the left, then the right, and over again. It was like the flickering of a candle.
You listened to everything I said, and you sat as a witness to everything I done tonight, and you still don't understand. That's a damn shame, boy, 'cause I thought you were gonna be my apostle. I thought you were like Luke and John and all those holy men who wrote the Bible. I thought I could use you to tell the truth, the real and gospel truth.
The shift in Homer's voice and phrasing was immediately chilling. Instead of the faux homespun shit-licker lingo, these few sentences were spoken in a slow, more precise manner. Goat had noted it only once before when Homer discussed the way the red mouth spoke through him to tell the truth. He wanted to replay that clip, to listen once more to what the man said then, because now he felt, no, he was absolutely certain, that it was far more important than the pseudo-religious rant of a psychopathic killer. He saw the dangerous look of cold disappointment in Homer's eyes and knew that he needed to do something right now. He said, "I'm trying to understand," making his words come out with equally slow and sober gravitas. "I want to understand. But the apostles, how many of them understood right away? They had to think about it, to witness it, to let it speak through them, right?" Goat was Jewish, but he'd seen enough movies to know the basic New Testament story. He'd even watched parts of that old Jesus of Nazareth miniseries during a filmmaking class. He grabbed for every detail he could snatch out of memory. Peter, the one who was Jesus' right-hand man, he didn't get it at first, but look what happened. He's the role model for the Pope, right? He was a fisherman, and don't they say that the Pope wears the shoes of the fisherman? He wasn't sure if this was exactly true or if it was something else from another movie. It sounded more or less right. "And all the others," Goat continued, keeping the rhythm of it going. "They became true believers. And Paul, what about Paul? Remember him? He was kind of a prick and a bad guy, and then something happened to him on the road to Damascus, and suddenly he's writing most of the New Testament." He paused, giving the moment a dramatic beat, choreographing it, directing his own performance. "You want me to tell your story, and I agreed to do that. If you need me to understand the secrets and mysteries of it, then you have to give me time to process it, to think it through, to let it speak inside my head and heart." Those were lines from an old movie, an art film about socialism in Paris, but he was pretty sure it was one Homer would never have seen. Goat twisted them to fit, pitching his tone to have a smoldering passion waiting to bloom. Or at least that's how he imagined it if he was directing someone for this scene. He hoped he was actor enough to pull it off. Homer Gibbon said nothing as the slow seconds ticked by. Then he reached out and touched Goat over the heart with the tip of his index finger.
"If you open your heart to the red mouth, you will see with the black eye."
Goat swallowed. "I want to. Just give me time." The killer gave him a single, slow nod and let his finger trail down Goat's body, over his stomach and groin, along his thigh, and up over the edge of the laptop.
"You better use this thing to tell my truth, or I will—"
"Homer," said Goat quickly, taking a terrible risk. "Don't. Look at me. Use the black eye to look into my eyes. See me. You don't need to threaten me anymore. We've crossed a line, Homer. We're somewhere else now." The moment stretched and stretched, and then Homer withdrew his hand. He reached for the door handle, but paused to pat Goat's bound left wrist.
"The rope stays on. Trust, like faith, is earned."
Then he got out of the car and began walking, bare-chested and erect, through the rain to the building with the free Wi-Fi sign. Goat sagged back and had to fight to keep from hyperventilating. It was an even harder struggle to keep from pissing in his pants. Then he was in motion. Even one-handed, he was fast on a laptop. He accessed the system preferences and found the Wi-Fi, connected to it, and began uploading the files. But as he did so, a small window popped up telling him that his email was sent. Email? It was only then that he remembered the message he had composed way back at Starbucks. In Bordentown, Homer Gibbon. Quarantine failed. It's here. Oh my God, he breathed, realizing that no one knew. Then he thought back to the violence on the road, the helicopters, the explosions. People knew, but they didn't know that Homer was loose, that he was on the road, that he was free. Goat used the webcam on his laptop to record a quick and desperate video message. He had no idea how much time he had or had left, so he made it short. He gave their location and explained what Homer had already done. He emphasized that Homer had killed people and had wounded others. He referenced Lucifer 113 and that Homer was, for all intents and purposes, the patient zero of this plague. He ended it with a statement that was both a call to arms for the authorities and a desperate cry for help. It took several agonizingly slow seconds for the video file to upload to his media listservs, including the one that had all of Goat's White House correspondent colleagues. Then he posted it on YouTube and immediately deleted the file from his computer. He kept glancing out the window at the building into which Homer had disappeared. It was a club of some kind. What could Homer want in there? He checked the video files of the interviews with Homer. Most were so big that they were still uploading, but many of the shorter ones were already up. He sent the same batch of them to his listserv using Dropbox and WeTransfer, dumping all of the raw footage into the media cauldron, praying someone would watch it, understand its reality and importance, and act on it. With all of that done, Goat scrolled through the video clips until he found the one in which Homer used the same eerie tone of voice. He watched it all the way through. It wasn't long, but it hit him like a punch to the throat. He watched it again, and again. It was on the third viewing that the whole truth broke through. The awful truth. He suddenly knew why Homer was here. Just as he knew why Homer had stopped those other times, he knew why Homer killed, and he knew why Homer sometimes spared lives. It wasn't mercy, and it wasn't any of his humanity connecting with individuals. It was something else. Something horrible. Something far worse than anything Homer had ever done, before or after he had become the monster that he now was. Homer wasn't on any vengeance kick. He wasn't hunting for his former foster parents. No, that was too mundane and cliché a motive for a person who was hearing the kinds of voices Homer heard. No, what Goat realized with perfect clarity was that Homer, knowing and accepting what he was, what Volker had done to him, had embraced it. He hadn't killed everyone at the 7-Eleven, but now that made sense. He hadn't killed them all, but he'd infected them all. The same with the people back at Starbucks. He killed some and fed on some, but his real agenda was spreading the infection. Like some kind of nightmare blend of John the Baptist and Johnny Appleseed, Homer was on the road to spread the word of his God, to spread the gospel of the red mouth and the black eye, to create the paradise that he'd envisioned, that he had spoken of, a world inherited by the meek, by the mindless dead, by those raised up as Jesus had been. At least, according to Homer's view of the cosmos. It was a horrible plan, but a very practical one. A workable one. Behind them, at the 7-Eleven and the traffic jam on the road, the infection was probably already spreading, outside of the quarantine zone. Goat snatched up his camera and babbled all of this into a live stream. He saved it and posted it on Facebook. Then he logged onto Foursquare, the social media app for sharing your location. "Find us," he begged. "Find us." Chapter 108. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania.
"Okay, listen up,"
said Sam into the team channel.
"This is a holding action. We don't fire until and unless there's a danger of a breach. Watch the fences. If they start putting pressure on it, we use selective fire to drive them back, or we drop enough to block access. This is a target-rich environment, but that's also a good way to burn through too much ammo. Check your targets. Headshots only. Unless you're pressed, take time for accuracy. Make 'em count."
Behind them, Des and Uriah Piper had set up chains of people to bring out the hundreds of boxes of food, water, and supplies. The chains split off to feed the stuff into a dozen Type C Bluebird school buses. Uriah Piper was running from bus to start engines and check fuel levels. A couple of teachers were busy siphoning gas from buses that were too low in fuel to make a long run or too badly damaged. Each bus had a standard capacity of 77 passengers and the driver, which meant that a dozen of them would easily transport the 800 survivors of Stebbins County with room for box supplies. Jenny DeGroot had found a can of spray paint and was writing a message on the outside wall of the school, but Trout couldn't read it at that distance. Probably a note about where the buses were going. Smart, he thought. Trout, too dinged up to help, was recording everything, and he hoped streaming it out to the net. He wanted people to know. Unfortunately, he had no laptop, so he couldn't check to see if anything was showing up on the web. Sam came over and looked Trout up and down.
"Do you have a gun?"
"No, I'm not very good with one."
"You're worse without one."
He bent and removed a small automatic from an ankle holster and held it out to Trout.
"Beretta 30-32 Tomcat, 7-round box magazine, less than a pound and fits into any pocket."
He showed Trout how to use the thumb safety.
"Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it."
One of Dez's favorite lines. Sam smiled.
"Des, is she your lady, girlfriend, wife, something?"
"Something. We've been a couple more often than you've had hot dinners, but recently we've been on a break."
"A break?"
"As in she keeps threatening to break parts of me I don't want broken."
"I joined the army because war is easier than love,"
said Sam. Very wise words. Trout glanced over at Des. "She's a foul-mouthed redneck who is, politically speaking, to the extreme right of Glenn Beck. But even with all that, I love her. Always have."
"That streak go both ways?"
Trout sighed. "Not lately.
Oh.
I mean, apocalypse and all. Not a hearts and flowers sort of thing."
"I hear you."
"Tell you what, though," said Trout. "For all of her rough edges, she has the biggest heart. She'd die for any one of those kids, and for most of the adults, too. No, that's not quite right. She'd happily and mercilessly kill for those kids." Sam nodded.
"A warrior rather than a soldier."
Trout cocked an eyebrow. "There's a difference?"
"Soldiers are called to serve, and when their service is done, they go home. A warrior lives on the battlefield. It is home."
Trout studied him. "Yeah, that's Des." He weighed the gun in his palm, nodded thanks, and put it into the pocket of his stained and torn sports coat.
"Listen, Billy, I think I'd better tell you some things. I heard from my boss, Scott Blair."
"Good news, I hope."
"I wish, but no. Lucifer has become an airborne pathogen now."
"Oh, jeez."
"Our bioweapons people are scrambling to mass-produce a different parasite that might render the infected inert. Not sure if it'll kill them or not. I don't think they're sure."
"How soon will they try that?"
Sam shook his head. "Not soon enough.
I told Scott that we're heading to Asheville. He said he'll call ahead to make sure we get an open door. Can we trust him? People should have trusted Scott from the jump. Trout took his point and nodded. They still want me dead? Sam gave a half smile. No, just the opposite. They want you to get out any information you can. Scott thinks it might help some people, especially if things keep going the way they're going. Sam, Trout said tentatively, how bad are things? No bullshit, how bad? I wasn't joking before when I said that we're losing this war. They may have to drop nukes to stop this. Are you fucking crazy? Are they? It's being looked at as the scenario resulting in the lowest number of casualties. And it was then that the full enormity of it hit Billy Trout. Until then, despite everything he'd seen and all that he knew, it had been a local issue. It had been a Stebbins County thing. Now he understood. Now his own words came back to pummel him, to lash at him. Reporting live from the apocalypse. Boss! Yelled Boxer. They're coming! They spun around and saw that a mass of them were at the fence, and the chain links and piping were starting to bow inward under the combined weight of more than 50 bodies. Can you really hold them? Begged Trout. Sam unslung his rifle. Tell your girlfriend to hurry. The Boy Scouts took careful aim and fired. Chapter 109. Pittsburgh International Airport. Did you hear? Captain James Yakima looked up from the flight log at his co-pilot for the non-stop to Paris. Hear what? The riots or the storm? Both, I think, said Beecher, the co-pilot. They're shutting us down. Shutting who down? Our flight? The airport, said Beecher. At least that's the rumor. God damn it, growled Yakima as he dug in his pocket for his cell. He punched in the number for his boss at Delta and had to wait 6 rings before the call was answered. Carl, what's this crap I'm hearing about the airport getting shut down? Beecher stood and waited while Yakima listened. Okay, with any luck I'll be eating a nice piece of veal at the Restaurant du Palais Royal before they pull the plug. Thanks, Carol. Keep me posted. He disconnected and placed the phone on the table. So, what's the verdict? Asked Beecher. Carol says they're going to do it, but the official order hasn't come through yet. The storm's going the other way. Local winds are below 20 and it's not the storm. Carol said they were going to impose martial law in western Pennsylvania and maybe parts of Maryland and West Virginia, too. For a riot? She says it's not a riot. Carol said her brother-in-law works for MSNBC and they're still running the virus story. I thought they shot that down. Yakima spread his hands. What can I tell you? The good news is that it doesn't affect us. We're wheels up in 66 minutes. Come on, let's get a coffee before we go aboard. He closed the flight log and stood up. As they headed toward the door to the crew lounge, a short fit of coughing stopped Yakima in his tracks. He coughed for 20 seconds, then waited, listening inside his body for more, and gradually felt the spasms stop. You okay? Asked Beecher. Yeah, it's nothing. Tickle in the back of my throat. I have some lozenges, said Beecher. In my bag. You want me to dig 'em out? Won't take a sec. Nah, said Yakima. It's nothing. I have 4 days off in Paris. If it's a cold, we're better for a little R&R. They headed out of the lounge, got their coffee, and proceeded directly to their plane. In a little over an hour, they were in the air, flying high over the storms of Pennsylvania, skirting the edge of the worst of it, crossing into New Jersey, and then far out over the Atlantic. Chapter 110. Trickster's Comedy Club, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The comedian's name was Jeremy Essig, and he felt like there should be sirens blaring and dogs hunting him, not just there at Trickster's, but at a lot of comedy clubs. After all, the image the audience saw was a sketchy-looking character looking nervous in a spotlight splashed against an unpainted brick wall. It screamed, "Escaped prisoner!" If not from a prison, then definitely from a facility for people with dangerous social disorders. And the audience was a lot like a posse. They seemed like nice people, but they could turn mean and dangerous in a heartbeat. He'd seen it. All comics have seen it. One minute you have a crowd hanging on your every word, laughing in anticipation of what you'll say before you even begin the joke, willing to follow you through twists and turns of skewed logic and occasionally clinical observation, believing that you'll steer the boat into port in some magical lands. That's when it's working right, when the rhythm is like jazz and the words tumble out with the kind of timing that opens minds and unlocks the muscles so that smiling and laughing is the easiest thing to do. Oh, those are the times when the comic and the audience are all together, sharing the ride, understanding each other on a level you can't really describe. But then there are those times when everything on the other side of the spotlight looks alien and hostile. Pale faces in the dark, staring with dead eyes, their mouths unsmiling, hands on tables or in laps as if they're too damn heavy to light for even a token clap. There are times when the joke's rhythm is off, like a discordant note that paints itself in the air, and no matter what else is played, that's the thing everyone can't look away from. Like that. What sucked most was that there was no pattern to it. Sure, sometimes it's hitting the wrong note or forgetting to take a look at the demographic, like busting on the Tea Party in South Carolina, or skewering Obama in Chicago, like being the first comic to make a joke after a crisis and really seeing firsthand what too soon actually means. Rookie mistakes that even the pros make, and Jeremy could remember too many of those moments in his own career. On the upside, after you survive the moment and crawl out of a dead gig like that, you can take the experience and spin it into material for another date. Tonight, though, the audience was right there with him. The mojo was red hot, and despite the late hour, they were all co-conspirators in a mad scheme. Plus, everybody was hammered. Even the waitstaff at Trickster's was in the bag, and the MC for the event, Lydia Rose, was smiling the kind of smile only a very happy, very drunk person can manage during that last hour before falling over becomes a gravitational imperative. Jeremy walked back and forth on the tiny stage, letting movement and the shifting of the travel spot keep any moment from getting stale. He wore an ancient Flaming Moe's t-shirt and scruffy jeans and looked as comfortable as he felt. The gig was largely impromptu. What had started with a standard double bill with him and Tom Segura and a handful of raw up-and-comers had become something else. The original show should have ended at midnight, but then word started coming in about how Superstorm Zelda had pretty much wiped a small town off the Pennsylvania map. A lot of people were believed dead, and there was a bunch of wild conspiracy theory crap thumbtacked to the story. Viruses, something about the National Guard trying to kill a bunch of kids, some asshole ranting about the apocalypse, and this was the best part as Jeremy saw it, zombies. Fucking zombies! They all had a good laugh about that during the break, but then they started hearing more and more about the number of expected casualties, and it stopped being funny. Jeremy couldn't remember who suggested doing a fundraiser. Maybe him, maybe Tom, maybe Lydia, or maybe it was one of those things that just evolved. At first, it was something they thought would be good if someone else did it. Then it was something they thought they should do. Then it became something they needed to do. Then it became what was actually happening tonight. Alcohol and some serious weed were involved in every stage of the process. Smoke your way to the right level and everything seems incredibly doable, even logical. The basic pitch was a comedy marathon for the duration of the storm, with Tom Segura and Jeremy Essig as ongoing headliners. Calls went out to other comics within driving distance. Finding a name for it took the longest. Tom wanted to call it Blow Me, Zelda. Jeremy liked Comic Relief, Redneck Edition. But Lydia thought they'd get sued for that. After another blunt, they settled on Laugh at the Storm, and bullied a friend who had a 501 to accept donations via PayPal. Now they were into the second hour of it. They streamed the show live to the net and put clips on YouTube, reposting those to Twitter and Facebook. Some friends of Jeremy and Tom Skyped in and did bits that were flashed onto the wall. While the comics were doing their bits, Lydia put the event on Foursquare, then pulled photos from the video stream and posted them on Pinterest, Tumblr, and Instagram. Suddenly, it was real. It was an actual charity fundraiser for the victims of Superstorm Zelda. The crowd at Trickster's were totally into it, and within 40 minutes, carloads of people showed up from all over Pittsburgh, fighting their way through storm winds and rain hard enough to swell all three of the city's big rivers. It was standing room only, and the bartenders were mixing drinks and pulling pints as fast as they could. Jeremy did several 20-minute sets, cycling through old material and some new stuff, and also improvising on what was happening. "According to the internet news," he said, half smiling as he paced in front of the audience, "there are monsters out in the sticks around Stebbins. Slack-faced, empty-eyed, unthinking, shambling hulks who will kill anything that moves. And aside from the locals, they also have zombies." The audience loved that. It was a running joke that the entire length of the state between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh was an even more redneck version of Mississippi. A red state with blue bookends, certified gold for observational comics like Jeremy Essig and Tom Segura. "It's not really surprising that they have a zombie outbreak in farm country. All those grains." A smaller laugh that time, but they were still with him. Jeremy took a beat to comment on the lack of laughs, and that got a laugh. One of the golden rules of his kind of comedy was to own the bad moments, so they were part of a shared experience, rather than simply try to limp away from a wounded joke. He switched gears a bit and drove his routine onto safer ground by talking about how people on the net were saying that the government was trying to cover up the zombie thing. No matter which lever the audience pulled, it was usually safe ground to attack the government as a whole. Not necessarily taking pot shots at specific politicians, but at the huge, self-destructive, creaking machine that was national politics. He saw Tom and Lydia watching from offstage, grinning and nodding encouragement. Jeremy took some of his old jokes about FEMA's failure after Katrina and gave them a Superstorm Zelda spin. "If you wait until the zombies eat most of the people, then you only have to save a few. And since the survivors will be the ones fast enough to outrun the living dead, you have people who look better on TV." From there he cruised into the vagaries of pop culture. "Tell me there won't be a reality show in 6 months. Real Zombies of Stebbins County. Strap on a lie detector and tell me we won't be watching that." And he was casting the show with redneck subtypes when someone in the audience screamed. It wasn't a scream of laughter, or even a shout of inarticulate drunken mirth. It was a real scream. A stop-the-show scream. The kind of scream where the entire crowd is jerked out of the moment, the spell instantly broken, and they focus on a single spot in the room. In the back of the small club, standing framed in the pale rectangle of light from the lobby, stood a tall figure. A man, bare-chested and wild-looking, grinning. The woman who had screamed sat at the table closest to the exit, and she and everyone at her table were frozen in a tableau of horrified recoil. And here Jeremy's mind began stumbling over the details. The man was wrong. His whole body was wrong. It was red. Bright, glistening red. Like he had been splashed by red paint, or... A Carrie joke started forming in his head in the split second before the red-splashed man turned, grabbed the woman who had screamed, hauled her to her feet, and he dug his teeth into the hollow of her throat. Chapter 111. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania.
"Forget the supplies," growled Sam. "Get the kids on the damn buses."
He didn't wait for Des to respond. He laid his rifle atop a car hood and began firing slow, spaced shots. With each shot, Trout could see the head of one of the infected fly apart and splash those around it with black blood. The other soldiers were nearly as good, and soon the bodies were piling up, clogging access to the fence. But that was one attack point. Des vanished into the building, but was back a moment later, leading a line of children. The kids were all holding hands. Most of them were screaming as they ran. Adults ran with them, shepherding the kids toward the buses. It started as an orderly evacuation, but with each second it began to disintegrate. Boxer yelled, "Hostiles at 9 o'clock! Count 70 plus!" He peered through a bus window and saw several tattered figures climbing awkwardly over the low chain-link fence. Boxer opened fire on them, but the wind was whipping up leaves and debris, spoiling his aim and warping the flight path of his rounds. "Close on them!" bellowed Sam. Boxer shot him a despairing look, then climbed down from the bus and began running across the playground toward that part of the fence. At 20 feet, he knelt, put his rifle to his shoulder, and began firing. Now, one after another of the dead pitched backward. The other Boy Scouts closed on other sections of the fence and began firing from closer range. The children kept screaming, and the sound tore at Trout's heart. It was a steady, unbearably shrill wail of total terror and total hopelessness. "We're losing the fence!" cried Gypsy. And even as she said it, a 15-foot section of the chain link collapsed into the schoolyard. Infected spilled forward, falling over each other, piling up, writhing and scrambling to keep moving forward toward their prey. Moonshiner and Gypsy began shuffling backward, yard by yard, while still firing. "Reloading!" called Moonshiner. "Last mag!" "Des, hurry up, goddammit!" roared Sam. Trout limped over to try and help, but there were already enough people. There simply wasn't enough time. 600 children, many of whom were too scared to leave the school. Many of whom had to be dragged or carried out. Some of them broke away and ran back into the school with teachers and parents chasing them. There was no order left in the exodus. Against all sanity, one of the children tore free from Mrs. Madison and went running directly toward the zombies who were getting to their feet. Trout could not understand it until he heard one awful, heart-wrenching word. "Mommy!" In the midst of the living dead, a woman with half her hair torn away and fingers missing from her left hand reached for the child, her mouth splitting into a mockery of a mother's smile, teeth bared to bite. Trout realized that he was running. Pain shot up his back and down his legs. Cracked ribs grated beneath his skin. His breath burned in his lungs, but he was running, angling away from the bus, racing to intercept the little girl. He reached her 4 paces before the zombie did. With a cry of agony, he snatched her up and tried to run with her. But his legs buckled, and he went down hard on his kneecaps. He twisted as he fell, hitting the ground on his back instead of crushing the girl under him. Then cold fingers were tearing at him, trying to rip the child from his arms. Black drool fell from ragged lips as the infected thing bent close to try and bite the child who had been her daughter when the world was a different world. Trout rolled sideways and kicked out, felt his foot hit something, heard a bone break, and then the zombie fell next to him. It did not react at all to its broken leg, but immediately buried cracked teeth in Billy Trout's shoulder. Chapter 112. Trickster's Comedy Club, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Tom Segura sat on a stool with Lydia, the short, curvy brunette MC. The two of them were having a great night, riding the wave of excitement that was their impromptu fundraiser comedy marathon. Tom was sipping a Red Bull and covertly trying to count Lydia's tattoos every time she moved. Some of them were in really interesting places. On stage, his friend Jeremy Essig was killing them with an on-the-spot series of jokes about a zombie reality show. Then everything changed. Just like that. From one side of a moment to the other. The audience was laughing their balls off about Billy Bob and Bubba, the zombies, and their monster truck, when suddenly a woman's scream knocked the whole night off its wheels. "What the hell?" cried Lydia, as she launched herself from her stool. Tom was a half-second slower, and he tried to see what was going on, but there was a waitress with a tray of drinks between him and the woman who had screamed. "Great fucking timing," Tom muttered as he tried to edge around to get a better look. On the stage, Jeremy looked like he was frozen into the moment, eyes and mouth wide. The whole club went silent for a heartbeat, but as Tom stepped around the waitress to see what was up, the entire club erupted into mad panic. Utter, mad panic. Suddenly everyone was screaming. Women, men, everyone. On stage, Jeremy screamed too. The part of Tom Segura's mind that was a regular guy felt twin pangs of fear and confusion. The part of him that was a professional comic actually provided commentary. "You scream like Chloe Moretz, dude." But then the crowd split apart as people panicked and scattered, revealing an image that Tom knew was being burned onto the front of his brain as he looked at it. A bare-chested, bloody man viciously tearing at the skin and muscle of a woman's throat. Right in front of him. This wasn't movie special effects, and as sure as shit wasn't someone's idea of a practical joke. What Tom was seeing 15 feet in front of him was real. Real blood, real flesh, real madness, real pain. And he screamed too. He did not remember picking anything up, and even when he threw the beer bottle, he was surprised that it was his hand that winged it at the attacker's head. Tom was not a fighter. He didn't know many comics who were. Words had always been his sword and shield. Sarcasm was his left hook, and insight was his right cross. He saw the bottle leave his hand, saw it close the distance in what appeared to be ultra-slow motion, saw it strike the killer right on the temple. As good a throw as anyone in the major leagues ever hurled. Dead on. 100-mile-an-hour ball that burned across the plate fast enough to make a fool out of a .300 batter. Tom expected the killer to go down. That would have been the button on this routine. That should have been the logical end, or maybe the opening act of a new phase of his career. Tom Segura, hero comedian, the stocky kid from Cincinnati who dropped a psycho with a bottle of Coors Light. That was the script he was already writing in his head. That was the lead for the breaking news. Except that's not how the scene played out. The bottle hit hard, hit with real force, hit hard enough to make a clunk that Tom could hear over the woman's gurgling screams. Then it ricocheted off of the killer and hit the woman square in the right eye. The bottle fell to the floor. The killer dropped the woman right on top of it. He turned to Tom and smiled with bloody teeth. Tom thought, "Oh, shit." Or maybe he said it aloud. He wasn't sure, because after that, he was screaming louder and more shrilly than Jeremy. Chapter 113. The Situation Room. The White House, Washington, D.C. "Mr. Blair!" yelled a young officer, one of the sharpshooters from the military intelligence group. "You need to see this!" Blair hurried over and bent to look at something on the officer's laptop. "What is it?" "We were able to pick the IP address of Gregory Wyman's computer from the files he uploaded to the net. Well, sir, he just uploaded a new batch." "Is it more of Trout's ramblings?" "No, sir. There are several files, including what appears to be interviews with Homer Gibbon. The auto-dating on the video files say that the interviews were all done in the last few hours." "Christ." "And there's more. Wyman posted a message, a plea that appears to be directed to us, to the military. He's asking us to find him because he is with Homer Gibbon, and Gibbon is spreading Lucifer." "Did he provide an exact location?" The officer smiled. So strange a thing under the circumstances. "Yes, sir, he did." Chapter 114. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. The pain was immediate and excruciating, and Billy Trout screamed. He thrashed and beat at the woman, trying to shake her loose. The little girl shrieked too, her voice as shrill as a seagull's, and she began beating her tiny fists all over Trout's face. She smashed his nose and hit him in the eye. And then another screaming, howling thing plowed into them. It hit the zombie with so much force that teeth snapped off at the gum line and the creature fell away. Trout instantly rolled the other way, shoving the child from him. He flopped onto his stomach and saw Des Fox sitting astride the infected woman, fingers knotted in what was left of the woman's hair, lifting her head and slamming it down on the concrete over and over again until the back of her skull exploded and sprayed the wet ground with brain tissue and black blood. The little girl shrieked again and tried to rush to her mother's defense, but Trout caught her wrist and pulled her, kicking and screaming, down to where he lay. Trout was screaming too, trying to determine how bad the bite was, trying to wriggle out of his jacket to see how soon he was going to die. The hysterical little girl kept hitting him, making it impossible to do anything. Then suddenly Des pivoted off the dead zombie, plucked the little girl off of him, and then started tearing at Billy's sports coat. She yanked it down and tore his arm from the sleeve, then pawed at his shirt to find the bite. "Am I dead?" Trout cried. "Oh, God, Des, am I dead?" And she kept saying, "Don't you leave me, Billy Trout. Don't you dare. Don't you fucking leave me, too. I'll fucking kill you if you leave me." The lightning flashed, and Des used its brief light to bend close. "God, please don't let me be dead," he wailed. Des straightened, glared at him, and slapped him across the face as hard as she could. It rocked his head sideways, and he snorted blood from his broken nose. Then she grabbed 2 fistfuls of his shirt and half hauled him off the ground. "It didn't break the skin, you stupid motherfucker!" She shook him hard enough to rattle his teeth. "I could fucking kill you, you stupid son of a bitch!" Then people were crowding around them, pulling her back, lifting him to his feet, taking the little girl away from the horror that lay on the ground. Trout saw Sam there, firing a pistol instead of his sniper rifle. Moonshiner was with him, too. Firing, firing, firing. There was an awful sound behind them, and Trout turned to see another section of the fence collapse, and a wave of the dead come rushing into the lot. At least 100 of them. Some fell with the fence, but the others climbed over them, shambling or running, screaming their hunger, moaning louder than the storm. Sam fired and fired. There was no time to aim now. Moonshiner yelled for them to get back. He dropped a spent magazine and reached for a replacement, which he did not have. There was one terrible moment when his questing fingers spider-walked across his belt and harness and found nothing.
"Shit,"
he said. He reversed his rifle in his hands and swung it like a baseball bat as the mass of zombies came swarming at them over the fence. Another section fell, and another. Hundreds of the dead were closing in on them. The bus engines roared and fists pounded on the horns. Children screamed somewhere behind them. Trout kept swimming in and out of consciousness, aware that he was being half carried, half dragged along, but with no idea who was helping him. He saw Des and Sam standing shoulder to shoulder, firing into the onrushing sea of the infected, trying to buy Moonshiner time to retreat. And then the dead were on him. "No!" howled Sam. The big soldiers swung the rifle once more, and 2 zombies staggered back with shattered faces, but a dozen more launched themselves at him. Sam fired over and over again, killing an infected with every shot. So did Des. It did not matter at all. Moonshiner vanished beneath a tidal surge of the dead. "Get onto the bus!" Someone was yelling that over and over again, but Trout couldn't tell who it was. It might even have been him. Hands reached out and grabbed Trout, pulled him, lifted him, and then he was out of the rain, inside the bus. But where was Des? He began thrashing, fighting the hands, struggling to get to the window to see if he could find Des. Guns were still firing. The dead moaned like demons. "Go, go, go!" yelled a voice. Sammy Murrah. Where was Des? God, thought Trout, as the darkness began to drag him down. Where is my Des? Chapter 115. Trickster's Comedy Club, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Lydia Rose was too short to see over the milling crowd. She saw the bloody man enter the club and saw Tom throw a bottle at him, but then everything went totally to hell. People screamed and screamed as they ran for the exits. They collided with one another and tripped over tables and chairs. Lydia was buffeted back by the crowd and fell hard against the corner of the stage. 5 feet in front of her, a frat boy in a pit sweatshirt lay sprawled like a starfish, eyes open, mouth slack, as at least 40 people ran over his body, not leaping across it, but stepping on the college kid's stomach and legs and chest. Then a skinny white woman with beaded dreads hooked a foot in the frat boy's armpit and pitched face forward to the ground. A dozen others fell atop her, wrenching a terrible scream from her collapsing lungs. Lydia crawled onto the stage where Jeremy was yelling at the crowd to get out, which they were already trying to do, and alternately yelling at the bloody man to stop biting the woman. It seemed to Lydia to be such a strange thing to yell. If the guy was biting someone, then how likely was it that he'd be reasonable enough to take Jeremy's suggestion to heart? What was he supposed to do? Let her go? Spit out what was left of her throat? Give a rueful apology and buy a round for the house? She got to her feet, and from the stage platform was able to see what was actually happening there at Trickster's. She saw. She screamed. Beside her, Jeremy was still yelling at the crowd. Across the club, Tom Segura was running from the bloody man and throwing chairs at him. Most of the chairs were hitting the guys who were trying to throw punches at the intruder. The bloody man snatched one of the chairs out of the air and swung it into the face of a burly football player who was winding up a haymaker. The football player went down hard. 2 other guys piled atop the bloody man, punching him with both fists. Lydia lost sight of the killer for a moment. Then she heard a piercing shriek, and one of the guys reeled back, clutching a hand from which blood spurted from the stumps of 2 fingers that were now missing beyond the first knuckles. The second guy rolled off, clutching his throat, and Lydia couldn't tell what the bloody man had done to him. Punched him? Tom waded in as the killer was rising to his feet, swinging yet another chair, but someone stepped into the path of the swing, and for a moment, Lydia couldn't understand what she was seeing. It was the woman who had been bitten. Her face and clothes were splashed with her own blood, and there was a black, ragged hole in the front of her throat, but she bared her teeth and leapt at Tom like a cat. They both went down, and Lydia lost sight of her friend. Then she was moving. She snatched the microphone stand from in front of Jeremy and leapt off the stage. She was only 5'1", and the mic stand was taller than she was, but Lydia took it in a 2-handed grip and swung it with all the force and focus of a major league ball player. The chrome shaft made a glittering arc, and the heavy black base hit the woman who was atop Tom right in the side of the head. There was a meaty crunch that sent such a shock wave up the length of the stand that it shivered it right out of Lydia's hands. She staggered backward and collided with someone. She felt hands on her shoulders, trying to pull her backward. Lydia pivoted and swung her right arm as hard as she could to dislodge the grabbing hands. She didn't need any Galahad to pull her to safety. Lydia knew how to fight, mean and dirty, and she wasn't about to let some psycho bastard hurt Tom. But as she spun, she looked up into the face of the man who had grabbed her. A tall man, bare-chested, ugly and powerful, covered in blood from eyes to knees. A man who smiled at her. A man whose dark eyes looked her up and down. "Nice," he said. "Juicy." And then he lunged at her, teeth snapping. "It's not funny," she thought. "This isn't funny." Those were her last thoughts, and then all she saw was a big black nothing. Chapter 116. Doll Factory Road, Stebbins County, Pennsylvania. It was too dark down in the hole, and there were too many monsters, so Billy Trout fought his way back to the surface. He came awake with a cry. For a moment, he did not know where he was. The world seemed to be moving. The ceiling was low and curved and seemed to be made out of metal. He heard voices, prayers, and whispers. People crying with dry, broken sobs that seemed to cling to the ragged edge of sanity. Other voices, younger and more plaintive, called for mothers and fathers and were not answered. One voice kept repeating the word no in a relentless monotone. Pain was the next thing Trout became aware of. Intense pain, and in many places. His nose, his chest, his ribs, his shoulder. Oddly, his back no longer hurt, as if somehow whatever had been dislocated before had slid back into place. What a small and random mercy that was. It felt cheap and out of place when so many others were so badly hurt and needed comfort more than he did. A shape moved above him, and it took Trout several seconds to focus his eyes. Woman shape, blonde, haggard, filthy, beautiful. Des, he breathed. Des Fox bent and kissed his forehead and his eyes and his lips. Then she bent and whispered into his ears, "Don't ever leave me, Billy Trout. Don't you dare." He constructed what he hoped was a smile. "Not a chance." The bus, for that's now what he realized it was, jounced and bounced as it rolled. Trout tried to sit up and nearly passed out again. He took a ragged breath and tried it again, this time with her help. "Where are we?" "Center of town," she said. "Doll factory." Trout saw Sammy Mora sitting with Gypsy near the front of the bus. They sat in identical postures, forearms on knees, heads bent. In weariness or defeat? No, he realized. In grief. "Moonshiner?" Trout asked quietly. Des shook her head. "No. Oh, damn. We lost Uriah Piper, too. And Mrs. Madison. 10 others." He closed his eyes, not wanting to see the way those words twisted her mouth. "Any of the kids?" "No," she said. Tears cut silvery scars through the grime on her face. "We saved the kids, Billy. We saved them." Chapter 117. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
You've heard of asking for a hand in marriage,
Homer
but
Gibbons
what about
said,
a paw?
You get it
That's
all
the
done.
situation in a
You
remote village
upload all
in
the
India,
film we
where a
did,
young woman
the
is
interviews
marrying
and
a
such.
stray dog to ward off
Everything,
evil. The unusual
said
wedding was
Goat
organized
weakly.
by the parents of 18-year-old
Everything's
bride
out there.
Mangali Munda to a dog named
It was
Shanu.
true. All of the video files had been uploaded to YouTube, with crosslinks on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. Goat could only imagine the feeding frenzy. He had also sent Volker's notes out. By now, it had been received by thousands and thousands of news sources. He even sent it to the White House, the CDC, and the Department of Homeland Security. Maybe it would do some good. But he had his doubts. While he waited for Homer, Goat checked the online news services. Lucifer 113 was already spreading beyond Stebbins. The president was set to address the nation, and the emergency broadcast network had replaced most of the regular stations. This was it. This was the actual end. Volker had called it a doomsday weapon, and tonight was the first night of the end of the world. Goat was sure of it. He was certain for 2 reasons. First, because of the news stories of the infection spreading. He didn't know, nor apparently did the reporters, whether the viral outbreak, as they were calling it, could be contained and eradicated. Maybe it could. There were some pretty extreme measures the government could take. The other reason Goat believed that the doors to hell were swinging open, the reason that filled him with true despair, was the insight he'd had while waiting for Homer to come out of the comedy club. It was a process. It was an analysis of character motivation, and Goat dissected it the way he would with actors playing roles in a movie. His training, after all, was movie direction. "I think I understand now," said Goat. Homer grunted. "What?" "I understand. I get it." The killer glanced at him.
"What is it you think you get?"
"Your plan."
"My plan? I don't have a plan."
"Okay. Let me put it another way," said Goat. "I think I understand what the red mouth is telling you to do. I think I can envision what the black eye wants everyone to see." Homer smiled. It looked like a genuine smile, too.
"You had a vision?"
"Not exactly."
"Then what? Did the red mouth start whispering in your ear?"
"Maybe," said Goat. "It sort of came to me."
"What do you mean? What are you seeing?"
"You're just going to drive across country, stopping every once in a while for a bite, and then keep going. You want to spread this thing as far and as wide as possible. You want to kill the whole fucking world, don't you?" Homer thought about it for a while as they drove on through the rain.
"Yeah, that about says it."
"Is any of that stuff about the meek inheriting the earth true? Was any of that what you believe, or was it all bullshit for the camera?" Homer's smile was slow and sly.
"Does it really matter, boy?"
"I need to know." The lights of the big rigs in the opposite lane illuminated Homer Gibbon as he smiled again and shrugged. "Wait, that's it?" demanded Goat. "You put me through all this shit and then you brush me off with a fucking shrug?"
"What's it matter to you?"
asked the killer.
"It's all gonna work out the same whether it's true or not."
Goat made a disgusted sound low in his throat.
"Dr. Volker told me what I am, and you know what that is, don't you, boy?"
Goat said nothing.
"I'm a fucking zombie. I'm already dead. You ever wonder why I move like I got arthritis? You don't know your basic medicine? I got rigor mortis. That means I'm already rotting. I may hear the red mouth speak to me, but when I look into the future with the black eye, you know what I see? I see me fucking dead and gone, motherfucker."
Homer suddenly struck the steering wheel with the heel of his palm.
"That's what I fucking see. Me dead. So I figure, what the fuck? I might as well turn this into a party town. If I gotta go, then everybody's gotta come with me. Every fucking buddy. And yeah, to answer your question, I do believe. And what I believe is that life's a bitch, and then we all fucking die. But not alone, boy. Not alone."
Homer punctuated his remarks with a brutal laugh, totally without mirth or humanity. A dead man's laugh, a killer's laugh.
"It's the end of the world, boy, just like the song says. And you know what? I feel just fine."
Goat stared at him, and something in his head seemed to break, to snap, to tear open. Maybe it was the black eye opening so he could see his own future. Maybe it was that. If so, the future that Goat saw was that of a desolated world. It was a wasteland of disease and rot, and there, standing amid an endless crowd of unmoving, unthinking, undying dead, was his own body, robbed of life, of hope, of any possibility of anything. It was the ugliest thing he could imagine, bleak and pointless. He leaned closer to Homer Gibbon, wanting to see the killer's face clearly in the whitewash of headlines. As each of the big interstate truckers whisked by, he saw that evil face in a stark strobe. Each blink, each flash image was identical, inert, eternal, irredeemable. He said, "Fuck you!" Then he grabbed the steering wheel in both hands, shoved it to the left with all his strength, and sent the Escalade careening into the headlights of a monstrous 18-wheel Freightliner pulling a full load of steel I-beams. Right into 80,000 pounds driving at 82 miles an hour. Although the impact opened 1,000 red mouths in the flesh of Homer Gibbon, they whispered no secrets, and the black eye went forever blind. Part 4. First Night. So, when the last and dreadful hour this crumbling pageant shall devour, the trumpet shall be heard on high, the dead shall live, the living die, and music shall untune the sky. John Dryden. A Song for St. Cecilia's Day. Chapter 118. Atlanta, Georgia. No one at the bar knew his last name. When asked, he said that his name was John. It wasn't exactly true, but true enough. John sat at the end of the bar, drinking red wine, making it last, paying for it with money he had taken from the biker he had killed. He would have more money when he sold the motorcycle. John was not a biker type. He disliked machines, and especially loud ones. Noise irritated him. It was hard enough to listen to all of the voices in his head without those kind of distractions. The bar was quiet, especially this early in the day. The bartender, 2 other early bird customers, and John. He'd come in as soon as it opened, found his favorite stool, and sat down to watch the news. So many wonderful things were happening in the world. Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, and Ohio had all clearly been touched by the hand of God. He wondered if that meant that it was starting. The fall. The collapse of the false world of idolatry and sin. It was something for which he had prayed every day of his adult life. It was something he always believed would happen one day. The fall. Then the news station interrupted its own broadcast to play another video clip from a reporter named Gregory Weinman. The reporter, who was somewhere in the affected area, had been sending videos all night, and at first the press had dismissed them as elaborate fakes and the worst kind of practical jokes. As the night burned away and the morning dawned with fear and promise, the reaction to those reports changed. Now they were being trotted out as hard news, news that terrified everyone at the bar, except John, who found them so incredibly comforting. The TV reporter warned that the footage they were about to show was disturbing and contained images not suitable for children. John saw the predatory gleam in the reporter's eyes. Then the footage began, showing a man that John immediately recognized as the supposedly executed serial killer Homer Gibbon, as he went into a 7-Eleven and began attacking people. It was all very messy and crude. John did not like biting. He always preferred knives. Knives held within them a purity of purpose. They were instruments of God's will. John had several of them in special pockets he'd sewn inside his clothes. He was never without his knives. The video played out, and then it cut to the interior of a car as Homer Gibbon spoke about why he was doing what he did. He spoke about seeing with the black eye. He spoke about hearing the secrets of the red mouth. The red mouth. That was something John understood, though he had never used the exact phrase before. Red mouth. How perfect. How apt. He mouthed the words, and they felt like ambrosia on his tongue and lips. He knew right then that he would forever use those words to describe what he, in his holy purpose, had done so many times and would continue to do if God willed it. Then Homer said something else that struck to the very core of John's personal faith.
In the Bible, Jesus talked about how the meek were going to inherit the earth. I forget where he said it, but it was important, and I think this is what he was talking about. The way people are when they wake up after I open the red mouths in their flesh.
Yes, said John. He said it a little too loud, a bit too emphatically, and the two other patrons turned to him.
What?
Asked one of them.
You agree with that bullshit?
John said nothing.
I asked you a question,
demanded the man, sliding off his stool.
I have friends in Pennsylvania. I have some family there.
John considered how to play this. He could construct a response that would dial the man's outrage down to a simple misunderstanding. He could do that because he had done that sort of thing many times before, and with sharper people than this. He had managed conversations with psychiatrists and parole review panels. And yet, on the screen, Homer Gibbon continued to talk about the meek inheriting the earth, and about how he was helping them have eternal life, about how it was God's will for a peaceful planet, a world without war, without hate, a world of the silent, mindless meek, a world of people emptied of everything except the grace of a loving and generous God. John understood and agreed with everything Homer Gibbon said.
Yo, asshole,
said the loudmouth, moving down the bar toward John.
I'm talking to you.
His last words were gone, trapped inside the man's chest, unable to get past the blood that now filled his throat. The man stared in uncomprehending horror at the glittering steel that seemed to have appeared as if by magic in John's hand. The other patron and the bartender gaped at what was happening, their incomprehension every bit as great as the dying loudmouth.
John?
Asked the bartender.
What the hell did you just do?
Explaining would take too much time, and John did not believe either of these men would truly understand. He killed them both. They tried to make a fight of it, as if that mattered. As they lay bleeding, with red mouths opened in their flesh, John watched the face of Homer Gibbon. This was the face of the chosen of God, the rock upon which a new church was being born in the farmlands of Pennsylvania. "You are my God," he told the killer on the TV, "and I will be a saint of your church." Smiling, filled with great joy, St. John wiped his knives clean and stepped out into the morning sunlight, knowing with total certainty that the noisy, cluttered, sinful world was about to fall. It was all going to become quiet, as God so clearly intended. Chapter 119. Route 40. Fayette County, Pennsylvania. The buses painted a long line of yellow through the gray of the pre-dawn morning. Des, Trout, and Sam sat in a huddle in the front of the lead bus. They passed a few cars, but they were all driving too fast. Panic speed, thought Trout. A UPS truck lay on its side at a crossroads, and several figures were hunkered down around a ragged red thing that twitched even as it was consumed. Off in the distance, on the far side of a massive cornfield, a farmhouse burned, flickering its souls to the winds. They found an armored personnel carrier standing alone and empty on the shoulder of the road. Sam and the remaining members of the Boy Scouts got out to check it. Des went with them, and Trout, weak and trembling, stood in the open doorway of the bus. There was no blood on the APC, no scattering of shell casings, nothing to indicate a battle. However, it was completely empty. No crew, no bodies, no traces of how it came to be abandoned there. Boxer, Shortstop, and Gypsy came back with armloads of ammunition and extra guns. Sam tottered back, carrying a heavy metal case of fragmentation grenades. They stripped the APC of everything of use, and all of it done in a hasty silence. Then they piled back into the buses, and the convoy began rolling. The landscape that whipped by seemed murky and deserted to Trout, though his gut told him otherwise. Twice he saw figures in the woods, pale and silent, watching the buses as they passed. Inside the bus, things quieted down. Many of the children were asleep, dragged into troubled dreams by shock and exhaustion. Others sat and watched the forest with the fixity of attention of a bunch of plastic mannequins. Des followed the line of Trout's stare and took his hand to give it a gentle squeeze. Sam sat nearby, thumbing bullets into a stack of empty magazines. His eyes were shuttered windows. Jenny DeGroot came and squatted down in the aisle. She had somehow conjured hot coffee. "It's instant," she apologized, handing out steaming styrofoam cups. Trout took his with a greedy sigh. "I don't care if it's boiled gutter water." He burned his tongue on the first sip, didn't care, blew on the surface, and took another sip. Sammy Mora sat with his head cradled between his palms, eyes unfocused as he stared into his own thoughts. "I was sorry to hear about your friend," said Trout. "Moonshiner," murmured Sam, nodding his thanks. "What was his real name?" asked Des. "Staff Sergeant Bud Hollister. Good old boy from Alabama." Des nodded. "He had biker tats. He used to ride?" A memory put a faint smile on Sam's hard mouth. "He rode with the outlaws before he moved from Bama." "Rough boys," said Des. "Very. He rolled out with them when he was 16, lying about being 19. He was with them until just before his 18th birthday, then got arrested for some petty stuff. Judge offered him a choice of jail or enlistment. Not that he stopped kicking ass and taking names as a soldier. Running joke was that he had Velcro on his stripes because he kept losing them." Trout cleared his throat and caught a look at Des. "Oh, lots of that going around." "Bite me," muttered Des. "You can live small and boring, or you can go and tear a piece off for yourself." Sam grinned. "You and Moonshiner would have gotten along fine." "He wasn't half bad looking." "Hey, I'm sitting right here, you know," Trout reminded her. Des ignored him. She held out her cup. "To Bud Moonshiner Hollister, a true American ass-kicker." "And a good man," added Sam, touching his cup. Trout did the same, and they drank in silence for a while. "After we get to Asheville," asked Trout, "what will you do? Stay there or go back?" "Back is a relative term. I'm not part of the regular army, so I don't have to report back. I'll stay in touch with Scott Blair, and if he needs me to do anything special, something that could help, then I'll do that." "And if there's nothing you can do?" Sam shrugged. "My family is in Central California. Dad and stepmom. Brother who's 20 and in the police academy, and a stepbrother who's 18 months old. Dad's a cop too, but he's getting up there. Been driving a desk for the last 10 years. Mom's an ER nurse. If this thing continues to spread, then I'm going to want to get to them and help keep them safe." "I hope it doesn't come to that," said Trout, and Des nodded. Sam made no comment. The conversation dwindled down to a shared moody silence. Trout stared out the window as he sipped the last of his coffee. Then he frowned. "Hey," he said, "I thought we were going to North Carolina." "We are," said Des. "Then why did we just pass a sign for Fort Necessity? You planning on visiting a historic battlefield during a flight to safety?" "I don't know, Des. I doubt the gift shop is open this early." "We're not going to the fort," said Des irritably. "We're going to Sapphire Foods. It's a mile past the fort on Route 40. I told you about it. The big food distribution warehouse." "Ah, yes, the one where your ex-boyfriend works, if he's still an ex-boyfriend." "Don't start, Billy." "It's a good call," said Sam. "We got less than half the supplies out of the school." Trout knew that it was a good idea, but he didn't want to admit it. He fished for an objection. "What if they won't let us take anything?" "We'll ask nicely," Sam suggested. "Charlie will give me what I want," said Des. "Charlie? Charlie who? And why would he give you anything? Would that be a matter of him committing a crime?" "We're in a state of emergency." "Uh-huh. And Charlie likes kids. He always has. He coaches the boxing and wrestling teams at the PAL and—" Whoa, wait. Are you talking about that, Charlie?" Des colored and said nothing. "Are you freaking serious, Desdemona Fox? Him?" "Who?" asked Sam, but he was ignored. "He's a scumbag, a thug, and very likely an actual criminal," said Trout. "He's not that bad." "Oh, your nose grew 6 inches when you said that." Trout shook his head in genuine disbelief. "I know you've dated some lowlifes over the years, Des, but how drunk were you when you thought dating Charlie Pinkeye was a good idea?" "He doesn't like to be called that. I don't care what he likes or doesn't like. Charlie's a psychopath. So's his brother and so's his dad. Didn't his old man kill Charlie's mother? It was never proved. Might have been suicide. But what does that matter, Billy? We're not going there so I can give him a blowjob. We need supplies, and I know that if I explain the situation, he'll help us. And if we need to, he'll let us stay there." Trout began to fire back a crushing reply, but the driver called out, "We're coming up on it." The bus rounded a curve in the road, and there it was. A tall double fence encircled a plot of land that had to be a mile per side. The heavy-gauge rolling gate was peeled back on its hinges, the pipe frame twisted into a useless curl. The vehicle that had hit it, a Staples delivery truck, was still wrapped inside the gate like a spider caught in a web. The driver's door was open and splashed with black blood. "No, no, no," said Des under her breath. In the middle of the property was a massive one-story building made from dull gray stone blocks. As Des had said, there were no windows at all, but along one side there were bays for 50 trucks. A dozen trucks were backed into bays. There were a dozen cars parked haphazardly in the lot, some crumpled together. One sat there, burning in the dying drizzle. "Oh, shit," breathed Trout. There were zombies everywhere. Dozens of them. Chapter 120. 151 First Side, Fort Pitt Boulevard, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Alex J. Berman stood on the balcony of his high-rise apartment and watched Pittsburgh burn. His wife held his hand, and her grip was like a vice, so tight that he knew she would never let go. Never. Screams rose up from below, and Alex bent forward to look down. 23 stories below, moving through patches of sunlight and shadow, the crowds surged. From up here it was impossible to tell who was infected and who was not. Or at least, not yet. Everyone was in motion. Cars and trucks moved through the crowds, and from up here they looked like leaves buffeted along atop a moving stream. Alex wondered how many of those people the vehicles rolled over. Up here you couldn't hear the sound of breaking bones. Only the screams and the gunfire, and the explosions. Those were continual. The rains had dwindled to nothing and then faded as the sun burned through the clouds. The sky above was pretty and blue, a bright blue, like the summer skies of his boyhood. Pretty. Birds flew up there, far above the sounds of dying from below. Behind him, on the other side of the closed French doors, fists beat on the glass. Small sounds made by small fists. Alex did not turn to look. He had done many things in his life, some brave, some crazy, but he was absolutely sure it would take a greater insanity and far more courage than he possessed to turn and look through that glass. He could not do that. His wife sobbed. Once, a deep sound that was filled with everything either of them ever needed to say. Except for one more thing. Alex turned to his wife and smiled at her. "I love you," he said, "and I always will." Her tears glittered like jewels in the sunlight. Still holding hands, they stepped off the balcony ledge. Chapter 121. Sapphire Foods, Route 40, Fayette County, Pennsylvania.
"What do we do?"
asked the driver of the bus. The lead bus idled in the short curving driveway. The others were still around the bend. So far, the infected in the parking lot had not reacted to the bus. They were all close to the building, which was hundreds of yards away.
"We have 3 choices," Sam said quickly when Des joined them. "First choice is we bug out now and take our chances with the supplies we have. It's less than a day to Asheville."
"Sure," said Des bitterly. "If the roads are clear, if people are going apeshit, and you know damn well they are, then those roads could be jammed and those buses can't exactly go off-road. It could take a day or it could take a week, and we don't have a week's worth of food and water. Nothing close to it. Most of that stuff got left behind at the school."
"Okay. Second choice is my team draws the dead off to one side, away from the building, while you park the buses and offload everyone through the loading bays. Then we make this home base."
"Good call," said Trout. "Right, Des? You said this place has plenty of food and water and their own generators." Des chewed her lip as she considered it. "There's probably enough fuel in the generators for maybe a week, 10 days at the outside. After that, the lights and heat and everything else shuts down. There are also no windows. Good for security, but once the lights are out, it's a big black box. And there are 2 bathrooms, but no showers. If it was a week, maybe. But since we don't know how long, and since we have no way of telling how many of those things are going to come sniffing around, we could be well and truly fucked if we get trapped in there."
"Agreed."
Sam sighed and nodded.
"Then that leaves the third choice. Plan A, I guess. We load as much as we can and we get back on the road."
They watched the zombies in the parking lot. "Can we actually do that with them hanging around?" asked Trout.
"No, we'd need to take them out. I count, 30, 32. They're spaced out. We can take them down."
"And how many more will come looking to see what all the shooting's about?" Sam nodded.
"Which means we need to work mighty damn fast."
"Hey," said Trout, snapping his fingers. "You Black Ops guys do assassinations and stuff, right? Don't you have silencers?" "First," said Des impatiently, "they're called sound suppressors."
"And second,"
said Sam,
"we didn't bring them because this wasn't that kind of job."
"Oh." Trout felt foolish, but then something else occurred to him. "Don't we have to check the building first before we go in? Who's going to do that while you clear out the yard?"
"My team gets to do both,"
said Sam wearily. Then he brightened.
"And I think I know a way to speed the process."
He outlined it to Des, who approved. Then Sam touched his earbud and explained the situation and the plan to his remaining team members. Trout couldn't hear their replies, but he doubted they were any happier about this than he was. But it all began happening very fast. Des told the driver of the first bus to go into the lot. The other buses followed. Sam jumped out and began walking alongside the bus, which proceeded at a pace slow enough to keep pace with him. Boxer, Shortstop, and Gypsy did the same. The plan was simple. The buses would enter, cut right, and follow the inside of the fence all the way around the building, staying so close that none of the infected could get between the fence and the buses. The engine sound drew the infected like a bright light draws moths, and soon the dead were shambling across the lot toward the lead bus. Sam and the Boy Scouts walked without haste toward them, and as each zombie came within 20 feet, one of the soldiers put it down with a single shot to the head. It quickly became a rhythm, easy and mechanical. Though to Trout, watching from the lead bus, there was a different kind of horror to this. The zombies closed in, they were shot, the convoy inched along, over and over again. Aboard the buses, people started cheering with each kill, as if this was a game and the number counter jumped up with each death, as if the infected were no more real than animated monsters in a video game, as if each of those infected had not been a person hours ago. It shocked and repulsed Trout. Lucifer 113 had stolen the life from these people, and this, the necessary killing, took away their posthumous sham of being alive. But the reaction of the people on the bus, the cheers like spectators at the Roman circus, seemed to strip away the humanity of each infected. It reduced them to things rather than people. Somehow this indifference, or detachment, or madness, or whatever it was, frightened Trout every bit as much as the plague itself. As each cheer went up, louder than the first, Trout thought he could glimpse a future where the survivors of this placed no value whatsoever on human life. He knew that this was shock, that this was a shared traumatic stress reaction. He knew that, but he feared it too. It took over an hour to clear the parking lot. It seemed like a year to Trout. When it was over, Shortstop peeled off and headed to the open gate to stand guard. At Dez's direction, the entire convoy of buses circled the huge building. Dez and Sam pressed their faces against the windows so they could examine the building. Along one section of wall were slots for employee cars. First in the line was a mint-condition 1967 fire-engine red Pontiac Le Mans convertible. Trout knew that car all too well. It belonged to Charlie Mathias. The other cars and pickup trucks were unknown to him. "Looks intact," she said after they finished appraising the building. Then she reached out and tapped the bus driver on the shoulder. "Think you can back this into one of those bays? Drove a tractor my whole life," said the man. "I can park this in a phone booth." He was as good as his word, turning in a good angle, spinning the wheel before shifting, watching the mirrors, and sliding down the slope to a gentle stop against the heavy rubber fender covering the base of the load bay. Des went back to make sure the door would open and found there was a half-inch of clearance. She closed the door, though, made sure it was locked, then hurried back to rejoin Trout. The other buses began imitating the process of backing into the bays. Most were able to manage it, but after a couple of them failed to do it, the driver of Dez's bus went trotting out to help them. Des exited the bus and waited on the deserted loading bay until Sam, Boxer, and Gypsy joined her. Trout lingered in the open doorway, feeling enormously useless. Des had 6 extra magazines for her Glock, and thanks to the APC they had looted, she had a second 9mm tucked into the back of her belt. Sam had switched from his sniper rifle to a more practical M4, and he had magazines tucked into every pouch and pocket. 6 grenades were clipped to his harness. "What's the call, boss?" asked Gypsy. Sam nodded to the service door at the far end of the bay. We knock and let Des negotiate with her friend, Charlie Matthias, if he's still alive. She believes he'll allow us to stock up, given the situation. And if he doesn't? Asked Gypsy. Des shrugged. I like the guy, she said, but I'm not married to him. One way or another, we're rolling out of here with food and water. Not really interested in taking fuck you for an answer. Boxer held out his fist and took the bump. Gypsy, said Sam, watch our backs. They moved away from the buses, running lightly, weapons up and out. Trout noticed how smoothly Des fit in with the Boy Scouts, like she belonged more to their world than to any other. In a moment of irrational jealousy, he wondered what would happen if Sam Imura and Des had to work together for any length of time. Trout did not like his chances in a competition with that man, not in combat and not in romance. Sam was everything Des liked. He was strong, confident, capable, and decent. Fuck, Trout murmured. Then he added, Billy Trout, you are a total damn fool. Chapter 122. Town of Stebbins, Stebbins County, Pennsylvania. Jake DeGroot drove through hell. That was the only way he could describe what he was seeing. The whole town of Stebbins was in ruins. There was death everywhere, but not enough of it was lying down. People, as torn and vacant as the three girls that had attacked Burl and the others, wandered through the streets. Many of them turned toward the sound of the front-end loader. Some even ran at it and tried to attack it. At first, Jake tried to avoid them, but the machine wasn't fast or nimble enough to zigzag through the crowd. He understood more about what they were now. On the slow ride here, he had put on headphones and turned the radio all the way up and listened to someone from the government say crazy things about a plague. A plague. A disease that made people murder each other. It sounded plausible, though Jake knew it was much worse than that. Even so, he didn't want to hurt anyone. Not unless he had to. Not unless there was no other choice. He ran out of choices on the way to the Stebbins Little School. By the time Big Bird was rolling down the road that led to the front gate, the way was clogged by victims of the plague. Unable to go around them or evade them, he took a breath, cursed God, and drove over them. The only mercy he received was that the engine noise was so loud he couldn't hear the crunching of bones. So many bones. He turned away from the biggest mass of them and plowed right through an open stretch of fence, rolled across the parking lot past empty school buses, looking for some sign, some proof that Jenny and the others were still safe inside the school. Then he rolled to a stop, idling, staring at two things. The first was the open doorway of the school. The infected wandered in and out, and Jake recognized some of the teachers among them. It came close to breaking his heart. Then he saw the second thing, words written in brown spray paint on the red bricks of the school wall. It was a message about who had been here at the school, about how they had left, and about where they were going. As he read it, the infected began climbing onto his machine. With a growl, Jake put the loader in gear, turned, and with some of the dead still clinging on, headed for the road that led out of town. Chapter 123. Sapphire Foods, Route 40, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. They were 20 feet from the service door when Sam froze, one fist raised. Then he waved the others up so they could see what he was looking at. The door to the building was not, as they first supposed, shut. It was slightly ajar, about a half-inch from a tight fit. That wasn't what jolted Sam, though. There was a partial handprint on the frame, just the palm and a thumb, the rest hidden by the door. The handprint still glistened with red blood. "Shit," whispered Des. "Can God give us one fucking break?" Gypsy and Boxer shifted to take clear lines of sight once the door was opened. "Des," said Sam, "you open the door. I go in first, then my team, then you. Keep all lines clear. Nobody fires until and unless I do." He shifted to allow Des to grip the door handle. Sam finger counted down from 3, and she pulled the door open quickly, blocked it with her leg, and took her gun in a two-handed grip. Sam went in first, moving silently on cat feet. The others followed, moving smoothly, weapons moving from corner to corner, covering everything. Des went in last, and stepping inside wasn't like stepping into a warehouse. It was like stepping into an abattoir. The place was massive, with hundreds of tall rows of steel shelves that stretched off into darkness. Most of the lights were out, except for small emergency lights bolted every dozen yards. There was not enough light to see into the building, but there was enough illumination so that Des could see that the walls to either side of the door and floor in front of her were splashed with blood. There were bodies everywhere, a dozen at least, and they lay in disjointed tangles, with arms and legs missing, heads crushed, necks chopped through. Trails of blood, shoes and bare feet, led off into the main warehouse and vanished down shadowy rows. Only one figure still stood. He was massive, with chest and shoulders so heavily packed with corded muscle that it made him look like a great pale ape. His skin was the color of milk, and there were dreadful scars covering his arms and face. Old scars, barely visible through the blood, both red and black, that covered him from scalp to boots. He glared at them with mad eyes, one bright blue, the other as red as a subway rat. He held a crowbar in one fist and a meat cleaver in the other, and he stood there, panting, wild and thoroughly savage. Sam, Boxer, and Gypsy immediately pointed their guns at him. Des pushed her way past the soldiers. "Charlie?" she said softly. The wild eyes flared, and for a moment it seemed as if this monstrous man would attack. "Don't," murmured Sammy Murrah. He said it very quietly. Charlie's eyes flicked to him for a moment, and the thick lips curled back from uneven teeth. Maybe it was a sneer, maybe it was a smile. In either case, it was unpleasant and feral. "Charlie," Des repeated. She lowered her gun, holding it in one hand and reaching out toward him with the other. The mad eyes blinked, and blinked again, and each time there was a fraction less of the frenzied look and a fraction more of sanity, of realization of self, of recognition. "Des?" "It's me, Charlie," she said. "It's okay." "Okay," echoed Charlie Matthias, as if that was the strangest word he'd ever heard. "Okay? Jesus Christ, Des. What's happening to the world? Nothing's okay." He let out a breath and lowered the weapons. Sam and his team held their ground, though. "What happened here, Charlie? Who are these people?" The bodies on the floor were so badly mangled that it was impossible to tell who or what they had been. They're my boys." Des frowned. "You're my crew. The guys I fucking run with." He looked around in confusion. "Rico, Tyrone, Tony Dale, and Fezimio. Christ, Des, what the fuck's going on? We were playing cards, and Rico went outside to take a piss. Then he comes in all crazy and fucked up. Comes back with a whole shitload of people I don't know, and suddenly everything went to shit. Rico bit Fez. Bit his throat right the fuck out. Christ, Des, he started eating him. How's that not fucked up?" Charlie's voice was rising to a dangerous, hysterical note, and as he ranted, he began waving around his weapons. Sam shifted to stand between Des and the big man.
Mr. Matthias, I am going to need you to calm down. Put down your weapons and put your hands on your head. Do it now.
Charlie stared at him with total incomprehension.
Who the fuck are you? What's happening? Somebody better fucking tell me what's going on.
Charlie! Charlie! Yelled Des, and her voice was so loud and sharp that Charlie flinched as if he had been slapped. Haven't you listened to the news? Don't you understand what's happening? It's a plague. It's spreading out of control and it makes people want to kill each other.
What?
Stebbins County is gone. Everyone's dead. Everyone, Charlie. Except a bunch of kids and some other folks, some adults. We have 12 school buses outside and we're trying to get out of here. We're heading down south, but we need supplies. I came here because I knew you'd help us. I knew I could count on you, Charlie. With each sentence, she changed her voice from sharpness to soft appeal. It worked on Charlie, drawing him back from the edge.
Is this real? Are you bullshitting me, Des?
It's real. We're in trouble and we need your help. He looked down at the weapons he held, considered them for a moment, then let them fall. The clangs they made echoed through the building.
Boxer, Gypsy,
said Sam.
Do a sweep. Stay together and make it fast.
They moved off, each of them throwing Charlie ugly looks.
Mr. Matthias,
said Sam.
Were you bitten?
Huh? Me? Well, no. Not that they didn't try. Christ. Fez chewed on my boot trying to bite my ankle, and that was after I busted his knees and broke his damn back. How does that make sense?
Des quickly explained the situation, compressing it into a few terse lines. Lucifer, Homer Gibbon, the outbreak, the parasites. When she got to that last part, Charlie bolted and ran for the men's room. They followed and stood in the doorway while Charlie stripped out of his bloody clothes and scrubbed his skin with hot water and soap, and then rubbed himself down with nearly a full bottle of Purell. Charlie was almost an albino, but he had some splotches of color. He rinsed his jeans and put them back on. The shirt was a total loss.
Clock's ticking,
said Sam. We need to, and then Shortstop cut in via the team microphone. Sam held up a hand and used the other to touch his earbud.
What have you got?
We got incoming, boss.
How many?
Too many.
Chapter 124. Coldwater Canyon Drive, Los Angeles, California. Albert Godown tied his running shoes, stood and stretched slowly, feeling the muscles come undone, the cramps from the long flight gradually releasing their hold on him. His wife, Mary, was by the park, holding a deep lunge. She coughed a few times, but she controlled her reaction to it, keeping it small.
You okay?
He asked. Mary nodded, then shrugged. It's good. He waited for more, but that was all she said. So he nudged it a bit.
You still sick to your stomach?
Not really. Albert walked over to her. Come on, he said. You were sick as a dog last night. Just air sickness. It was like a rodeo up there.
Are you sure? They're still talking about some kind of flu on the news.
She shook her head. It's better than it was. Might have been allergies. Did you smell the air on the plane? Until they closed the doors, it smelled like we were parked right next to an open sewer. Burned my eyes. He nodded, though it hadn't bothered him as much.
It was worse by that hotel.
Because of the first wave of Superstorm Zelda, the flights the day before had been canceled, and the airline had put them up at a hotel near the Pittsburgh airport. The kind of hotel you only ever stay in if your flight is canceled, and is that or sleep in the terminal. They'd worked out in the little gym, and when the rain let up for an hour, they jogged around the property for an estimated 5 miles. That, at least, had been the plan, but halfway through it, the humidity turned the air into a cold soup more conducive to swimming than running, so they bagged it and went inside. That humid air stank, too. and that's when Mary's cough started. A tickle at first, and then worse as the evening went on. It came and went, and didn't really settle down until this morning when they got a 6:45 flight out of there. They changed planes in Chicago after a 3-hour layover, and Mary's cough sparked up again, but settled down once they were on the plane. Now it was back to being an infrequent thing. Still there, though, and he thought she should have it checked out. He told her so. "It's just allergies," she said. "Or whatever. I bet if we get a good run now, it'll just go away. It's so nice and dry here." To prove her point, she took a deep breath and let it out. "See? No cough." He shrugged, and they set off. They each wore headphones. Mary had her iPod set to one of her playlists. Albert could never imagine jogging to classical music. It seemed so counterintuitive to cardio. He usually listened to classic rock, or, as with today's run, the BBC News station. Better and less biased coverage than any of the domestic stations. But before they'd gone half a mile, he began frowning, and soon his run slowed to a walk, and then he stopped, touching an earbud to make sure he could hear everything. Mary ran on for half a block before she realized she was alone. Then she circled back. "What is it?" He pulled one earbud and gave it to her. They listened together as the BBC reporter talked about an outbreak of a disease that was so dangerous that the military was using force to stop those infected from leaving the quarantine zone. Albert saw Mary mouth the word military. The reporter said that the quarantine zone included large parts of Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, and Ohio. They stared at each other, stunned by this, not believing it, unable to not believe it. They looked around them. The California sun was still shining. Birds coasted on the thermals high above them. Children played in front yards. The reporter said that the estimated death toll might reach 500,000. Mary said, "What?" All Albert could do was shake his head. This happened while they slept in an airport hotel, while they were in the air. But it must have started while they were still in Pittsburgh. It had to have been mere miles from them. How did they not know about it? How could something this big have spread so fast? Mary coughed again and wiped at her mouth. Albert didn't much notice it this time. His mind was reeling. Then Mary coughed again, much harder, much louder. It doubled her over, and Albert lunged to catch her. "Jesus Christ!" he cried as she sagged against him. "Are you all right?" She wiped her mouth with the back of one trembling hand. And the moment froze for both of them as they stared with abject horror at the wetness smeared across her hand. It was not the colorless wetness of spit, nor was it blood. It was black, and in the black wetness small white shapes wriggled. Mary screamed. Albert screamed too. Chapter 125. Sapphire Foods, Route 40, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. They hurried outside and stood on the dock, watching with sagging hearts and growing horror at the roads beyond the fence. Des felt like she was caught in an endless loop. This was the schoolyard all over again, except there was a 40-foot wide gap in the fence. Sam turned to his team.
"We need to secure that fence right now."
Charlie stared at the approaching wall of the dead.
"Hope you don't expect me to—"
"No," said Sam tightly.
"You can go back inside and help Des find what she needs. Do it fast and do it now."
Charlie got a look at Des and straightened as if realizing how bad his remark sounded.
"Hey, don't get me wrong. I'd hold the line, but I don't got a gun."
Sam's eyes were cold.
"You won't need one to carry boxes. We'll hold the line."
With that, he turned away and began running toward the open gate with Boxer and Gypsy at his heels. Des lingered for a moment, then spun and raced for the building, shouting for all the adults to gather on the dock. Charlie's pale face had turned beet red. He caught Trout smiling.
"Fuck you grinning at?"
"Nothing at all," said Trout. He began limping toward the loading bay, determined to be of some use, however small. Charlie shoved him roughly aside and jogged heavily after Des. He didn't see Trout shoot him the finger. Trout had just reached the loading bay when the gunfire began. He looked back and saw that the road was crowded with the dead. Chapter 126. Mariposa County, California. The cadets came in from a long run, all of them panting and sweating, some of them laughing, a few too exhausted for trash talk and chatter. One young man trailed the group, walking slowly while stretching his arms. He had been among the first group to complete the 10-kilometer run through the hills, but he had stopped for a long yoga cool-down. The other cadets nodded to him as they passed. Although he was a quiet and introspective man, he was well liked and respected. The day was beautiful, and even when the last stragglers had gone inside, he lingered to consider the fleet of white clouds sailing high above the mountains toward the eastern horizon. The birds of autumn sang in the trees, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of dogwood and California lilies. The young man smiled at the day. As he mounted the steps to the front door, he thought of his little brother, who was 1.5 years old. Maybe he'd take him for a bike ride to a hummingbird garden. The kid would like that. His fingers were inches from the door when it suddenly swung outward so fast it nearly smashed his hand. The young cadet jerked his hand back as his friend, Jerry Buckley, came bursting out of the building. The men collided, but the young cadet was always fast on his feet, and he grabbed his friend and spun him, keeping them both from falling. "Damn, Jer!" he barked. "What the hell?" Jerry grabbed the front of his sweatshirt with both hands.
"Christ, Tom, I gotta get home. It's all going to shit."
"What is?"
"That thing back east. That plague. Holy shit, man, they're saying that they lost control of it. It's showing up everywhere."
Jerry tried to pull away, but the young cadet, Tom, held him, kept him right there. "Who said this? The news?"
"No,"
said Jerry.
"They made an announcement as soon as we got in from the run. Everyone's getting changed and getting their shit. They're sending us all home. You should get your gear and get to your folks' place, man. This is all falling apart."
"Slow down, Jer," said the young cadet. "That's the other side of the country." But Jerry was already shaking his head.
"No, aren't you hearing me? It's everywhere.
It's in L.A., yelled Jerry, pulling away.
"At the airport. Jesus, Tom, it's already here."
As if to punctuate his words, the air above them was torn by the grinding of helicopter rotors, and they looked up to see a wave of Apaches heading south. 4 big Chinooks followed behind them. Higher still, the contrails of jet fighters gouged white scars in the beautiful morning. Tom stared at them, and inside his chest, in the core of his heart, ice began to form.
"God Almighty," he breathed.
Jerry began backing away.
"This shit is really going south, man," he said. "Get to your folks' place. They live in that gated place a couple hours from here, right?"
Tom nodded.
"Sunset Hollow, up north. We'll tell everyone there to close the damn gates," said Jerry.
He took an abrupt step forward and took Tom's hand.
"Listen, brother, you take care of yourself, you hear? From what they're saying, this is going to get really bad. You do what you have to do to keep your family safe. You hear me? You do what you have to do."
Then Jerry pulled Tom into a fierce, brief hug. He pushed him back, spun, and ran for his parked car. Soon other cadets were pushing their way out of the building, running. Then Tom was running too. Into the building, down to his locker where his clothes and weapons and keys were. Then back out of the building, catching only seconds of the TV broadcast in the muster room.
"I can see the city. Oh my God! Pittsburgh is burning!"
He had no memory of reaching his car, of starting it or driving it, but the radio, that he remembered.
"LAX is under siege. SWAT and TSA agents have been overrun."
Every account was hysterical. every account was worse. Another wave of helicopters thundered overhead. As he drove, Tom tried to call his parents. No one answered the phone. Not the house phone, not their cells. "Please," he begged, as he slammed the pedal all the way down, pounding the horn, tearing along the shoulder of the road, running red lights, spinning the wheel to avoid collisions with a handbreadth to spare, forcing other drivers to careen into each other to avoid him. "Please." Tom was not a deeply religious man. Not until then. All the way from the police academy to the gates of Sunset Hollow, he prayed with his whole heart and every shred of need, begging whatever powers there were to take this back, to make it not real. Los Angeles was 300 miles away from where his parents lived in their quiet home behind high walls in Mariposa County. Chapter 127. Sapphire Foods, Route 40, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. They worked in frenzied silence. The bodies of the infected Charlie had killed had been dragged into a corner and covered with a tarp. Big rolls of plastic had been spread over the bloodstains so that nobody tracked black blood onto the buses. Charlie went up and down the aisles with Des, with Trout limping along behind. It irritated him that Charlie was suddenly so helpful and conciliatory. Trout knew that the big man was trying to make up for his moment of weakness outside and maybe for being crazed out of his mind when they arrived. Trout could easily forgive Charlie for that part of it. Under the circumstances, anyone who had the good sense to go completely mad was doing themselves a favor. What Trout didn't like was Charlie being Mr. Friendly. He knew about the man and about the whole Matthias family. Some folks liked them because they were funny and, in their own strange way, charismatic. A lot of people feared the Matthias clan because they were every bit as dangerous and unpredictable as they appeared. Trout detested them and always had. He had done too many news stories in which one or another of that family were suspected of a crime, and those crimes ranged from domestic violence to grand larceny to murder. Lots of arrests, but never a single conviction. And yet Des not only liked Charlie, she used to date him, if one can actually date a simian subhuman. Other, less polite words occurred to Trout than date. Even with that, Trout had to admit, however grudgingly, that Charlie was a big help. His knowledge of the warehouse and its contents shortened the process tremendously. Then Jenny DeGroot came running to find them. "Des!" she cried as she tore along one of the rows. "What's wrong?" asked Des, hurrying to meet her. "That soldier, Captain Imura, he's in trouble. You'd better come quick." Des blew past Trout and raced for the door. Charlie was right with her. By the time Trout managed to hobble to the loading bay, the sun was above the horizon and the long night was over. But the nightmare was not. The dead were inside the parking lot, and there were so many of them. Far too many. Boxer, Shortstop, Gypsy, and Sam were walking backward, firing as they retreated. They killed a lot of the dead, but it wasn't even making a dent in the seething mass of infected. "Oh, my God," whispered Jenny, her hand covering her mouth. "Where are they all coming from?" Trout shook his head. Jenny asked another, even more destructive question. "How bad is this?" Trout whirled. "Jenny, get everyone on the bus. Tell them to drop whatever they're carrying and get on the damn buses. We need to get out of here right now." Then he was yelling and grabbing teachers and parents who were standing and watching with slack jaws and horror in their eyes. He shoved them toward the buses. "Get the engine started," he bellowed. "Pull out of the bays and get into a line. Check all the windows. Come on, move!" The gunfire was louder but more sparse, and when he turned, he saw that the soldiers were no longer backing away. They were running. It was a full rout. Sections of the fence were bowing inward, but that mattered less than the steady stream of zombies who crowded in through the big open gateway. Trout's orderly mind kept wanting to quantify them, to put a number to the horde. 1,000? No, that was too small a number. 2,000 or 3,000 at the very least. Coming from where? He tried to remember how many towns were nearby. There were a number of them, but not enough to account for these numbers. Then Trout remembered the highway. All those cars, all those travelers. Had something happened to block the highway? And had the lines of stopped cars become a feeding frenzy? He didn't know and probably never would, but it was the only thing that could account for there being so many people here. So many dead people. Not all of them were slow. Some of them ran like sprinters, cutting ahead of the slower zombies, racing to try and tackle the soldiers. They ran so fast that it sometimes took 2 or 3 shots to bring them down. That gave the slower ones more time to stagger forward, and it wasted bullets. We're all going to die, thought Billy Trout. The last of the adults were piling onto the buses. "Des!" screamed Trout. "Come on!" Des Fox stood halfway between the loading docks and the front rank of the living dead, firing her Glock, dropping empty magazines, swapping in new ones, firing, reloading, firing. All the time she did this, she screamed. Rage and terror. Charlie Mathias had a length of black pipe in his hands, 8 feet long and bent in 2 places. He'd run up to a gap between Sammy Morrow and Gypsy and swung the pipe with incredible power and ferocity. Infected were hurled aside like broken dolls. He hit and hit and hit, the massive muscles flexing under his milky skin. He, too, screamed. The bus engines roared to life, and the first of the convoy pulled out of the bay. The others woke up with terrible slowness and crept into line. All too slow, thought Trout. Too slow. He thought, in all the confusion, that he heard another engine roar over to his right. A different engine, but it vanished again. A hallucination, thought Trout, and he wasn't surprised that his mind was fracturing. He hobbled forward to where Des was reloading. "Get into the bus!" he shouted. She ignored him and slapped the new magazine into place, raised her weapon, but didn't pull the trigger. Instead, her eyes went as wide as saucers, and she said, "What the fuck?" Trout heard that strange engine roar again, and as he turned, he saw something moving beyond the throng of dead at the gate. It was big and yellow, and for a moment he thought it was another bus. Had they lost one on the way here? Had someone else come up with the same plan? But then the front of the vehicle seemed to lift. No, it did lift. With a sharp whine of hydraulics, it raised up as the machine smashed into the packed dead. The impact sent bodies flying, but some seemed to hang in the air. Then Trout realized they weren't hanging, they were clinging to something, to the part of the machine that had raised up. His mind fought to make sense of it. Then the machine turned, and he understood. It was a massive piece of construction equipment. Bright yellow, washed clean by the rains and wearing a writhing coat of moaning infected, it was a front-end loader. Monstrous and bulky, improbably heavy, riding on 8 huge wheels, the machine crashed into the dead, rolled over them, ground them into bloody paste. The bucket rose, and Trout could see that it was completely filled with struggling dead. The driver tilted the bucket to let them fall, then brought the steel bucket down on top of them. The dead in the parking lot seemed to be caught in a moment of indecision. Fresh meat was in front of them, but their instinct to pursue noise and movement compelled them to react to the machine. Some of them left the chase and began shuffling toward the loader. The rest turned stiffly back and continued to chase Sam and his team. In that instant of indecision, though, Sam turned and ran, yelling to the others to move, to abandon the fight. Some of the faster zombies tore through the crowds in close pursuit. Des moved up to offer covering fire, and Charlie Mathias shifted into the path of 2 running infected. He swung his pipe at the knees of the first one, sending it crashing to the ground. The second tripped over it and fell, and before it could climb back to its feet, Charlie smashed its skull. Then 5 more of the fast ones broke from the pack and ran straight at Charlie. They were between Des and him. He was in her direct line of fire. Charlie flung his pipe at the leading zombie, pivoted like a dancer, and sprinted for the line of parked cars. Trout lost sight of him, and a moment later he saw Des turn away. Charlie had either made it to safety or not. The big front-end loader was still by the gate. The entire cab was covered in zombies like bees on a honeycomb, but the driver kept rolling forward, kept raising and lowering the heavy bucket. The movements were so erratic, though, that Trout couldn't tell if he could ever see out of the control cab. Des fired at the front rank of zombies as the soldiers reached her. Then the others turned, and suddenly they had a shooting line. They fired as they walked backward. The dead kept coming, and the gap between the soldiers and the infected was rapidly closing. 50 feet. 40. 30. Trout could see from the looks on their faces that they knew they weren't going to make it. That's when the first of the buses came hurtling past the line of shooters and plowed into the dead. It was a wonderful, heroic, desperate move, and it was absolutely the wrong thing to do. School buses are tough, but they are not built for head-on collisions with masses of people. The bus struck the wall of zombies and slammed to a stop. Everyone inside was thrown forward. The driver's airbag burst out and slammed the driver backward. The windshield cracked in 1,000 places. "Shit!" yelled Trout, and he began running toward the bus. Running hurt. Every step was screaming agony. He took that pain and ate it. He fed on it. He devoured it whole and used its fiery heat to drive his legs and propel him off the dock and around the back of the bus to come up on the side farthest from the zombies. He jerked the door open and saw that the driver, the farmer who had driven tractors all his life, was out cold. The airbag, designed to deflate after impact, was sagging. Trout grabbed the driver, hauled him out of the seat, shot the handle to close the door, and slid behind the wheel. Kids and adults were both screaming. Zombies were pounding on the cracked windshield. It was not going to last. He backed the bus up to get a better angle to go around the swarm. There was a series of loud thumps on the side and then on top of the bus, and to his horror, Trout realized that bodies were scaling the side of the bus. He started accelerating and was about to jam on the brakes to try and jolt the dead off the roof when he heard a fresh barrage of shots. From above. He looked to where Des and the soldiers had been, but they were gone. Then he understood. When the bus crashed, Des and Sam and the Boy Scouts had clambered atop the bus, out of reach of the dead. Could the dead climb too? He had no idea. He began moving forward again, but the dead were closing in and forming an impenetrable wall. With every few feet, he had to slow down or risk another collision. The windows would never withstand another hit. Then there was that engine roar again, and the front-end loader came smashing through the wall of dead. The digging teeth of the big bucket crunched into the backs of the zombies, shattering spines, snapping their bodies backward. The dead still swarmed over the cab, but one by one they pitched off. Almost as an after-echo, Trout heard gunshots from above. Des and the others were clearing the dead off the cab so that the driver could see what he was doing. Trout felt movement beside him, and Jenny DeGroot was there, staring out the window in astonishment, pointing at the driver. "Uncle Jake?" she gasped. Trout understood. The big, burly man in the loader's cab was Jake DeGroot. He wore a fierce, strange grin as he worked the levers that brought the bucket up and down, up and down. From above, Trout heard Des screaming 2 words. "Turn around! Turn around!" Jake either heard it, despite the din of gunfire, moans, and engine roars, or he simply grasped the need of the moment. He began backing and filling, making a big, bloody, bone-breaking, meat-burst turn amid and atop the milling dead. They were legion. But the diesel monster with the hydraulic bucket was unstoppable. It completed its turn and began rolling toward the front gate, crushing everything in its path. As more of the dead swarmed up onto the cab, Des and the soldiers shot them down. The gunfire from above was continuous. The front-end loader roared out with a voice like a dragon. Jake lowered the bucket so that it scraped along the surface of the ground as the tons of unfeeling yellow-painted steel, splashed now with red and black, hit the wall of unfeeling flesh and bone. The front-end loader paused but for a moment as it pushed through tons of slack meat. Then the bodies fell to either side, creating a chute through which 12 yellow buses passed. When the loader reached the road, it turned right, and Trout followed. Trout caught a flash of red off to the far side of the lot and saw Charlie Mathias's red Le Mans go rocketing out of the gate, turn left, and head west. Within seconds, the vehicle was dwindling into the distance. In rumbling convoy, they left the warehouse behind. The dead followed in their hundreds, but even at the slow speed of the loader, the shambling mass of infected fell farther and farther behind. Soon, they were not following at all. Chapter 128. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. Scott, Blair, and the President stood side by side in front of the big screen. There were now dozens of smaller windows open to show live streams of ongoing battles, of troops moving into position, of swarms of the dead moving through towns and cities, of the mass exodus of whole populations trying to flee the outbreak. The reports were coming in from all over. The latest incidents were in Oregon and New Hampshire, anywhere a car could drive or a plane could fly, which was everywhere. There was even an unconfirmed report of an attack in Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. A Delta flight from Pittsburgh touched down there. The news reports were erratic, wild, and probably true. England, Italy, Germany, and Russia had fighter bombers on deck, waiting for go orders to make preemptive strikes. Blair had no doubts that those orders would be given. Just as news stories went viral on the internet, infecting the world at the speed of social networking, so now could a biological threat spread globally at the speed of modern travel. Planes, trains, and automobiles, and wind. The devil was in the wind now, and the earth itself was exhaling the parasites into the global weather pattern. Soon Lucifer would be everywhere. An aide came hurrying over and handed the president a paper which he read, sighed, and handed to Blair. It was from Dr. Price. The Reaper counterparasite was in full development now. The first batches were being loaded into rockets for deployment over Pittsburgh. "We're going to use a monster to fight a monster," said the president. "How wrong does that sound to you, Scott?" "We have to try something. We have to try everything." "Yes, I suppose we do." One of the small windows showed an aerial surveillance feed of a line of yellow buses rolling through the forested hills of West Virginia. The president touched the image, brushing the vehicles with the tips of his fingers. "Oh, those children," he said. "The children of Stebbins and the children everywhere." "Sir?" "They will never forgive us for this," said the president. Blair's mouth was a tight and bitter line. Maybe they shouldn't. The door burst open and Sylvia Ruddy came running in, her face flushed, eyes wide with a fierce excitement. "Mr. President! Oh my God, Mr. President!" Chapter 129. Zabriskie Point Biological Evaluation and Production Station, Death Valley, California. All of Z Point had become a hive, filled with techs and aides and support staff who ran everywhere in a mad scramble to prepare all samples of Reaper and to kick the manufacturing process into high gear. Dick Price was the only person who stood still and silent. There was a big glass window separating him from the main production floor of the station. Everyone on the far side of that 3-inch thick glass wore hazmat suits. He was in his immaculate white lab coat. To his right was a bank of security monitors, and 3 of them showed exterior views of the helipad carved high onto a mountain, far away from any possibility of civilian ground or air traffic. A powerful Chinook was lifting ponderously from the pad. In the air beyond it were 3 more, waiting to land, waiting to offload viable organic vectors. A nice name for people who had been transformed by Lucifer into something else. The military kept bringing more of them here to Z-Point in the hopes that among the samples would be evidence of mutation or variation. Within mutation lay potential. Mutation suggested that Volker's monster was not unchangeable. Anything that could in time be changed could in time be understood and defeated. In time. Price felt icy lines of sweat trickle down his spine. 3 of the monitors had been switched to live news feeds. Pittsburgh was in flames. The whole city burning. There were outbreaks in Philadelphia, New York, D.C., Atlanta, a dozen other cities, and now there were reports in Paris, London, and Madrid. The experts the press trotted out decried these reports on the grounds that no disease could spread that fast. And that was true enough if this was the beginning of the 20th century instead of well into the 21st. Any disease could spread at the speed of transportation. A lot of planes flew out of Pittsburgh in the hours after the fuel air bombs shot the parasites into the atmosphere and transformed Lucifer from a serum transfer pathogen to an airborne pathogen. A whole lot of planes. Beyond the glass wall, his people worked like crazed ants to produce and pack the Reaper mutagen. Price was too numb to pray that Reaper would work. The tests on the Volker infected were ongoing, but it would be months before any reliable conclusions could be drawn. He had told the president that. He had told the generals that. It might work was 1,000,000 miles away from it will work. It was even farther from we should try it. If only they had Volker's notes. He prayed to a God he'd long ago ceased to believe in. He prayed with every fiber of his being that there was still time to find that research and to study it for a doorway out of this hell. On the monitor, the 2nd Chinook was now landing on the pad, and the 1st was already dwindling in the distance. His cell rang, and it jolted Price out of his horrified daze. He fished it out of his pocket and saw that the scramble alert was active. He punched that button and held the phone to his ear. "This is Price." "We have it," said a breathless Scott Blair. "What?" "The reporter who had them gave them to his cameraman, and he sent it all via Dropbox to his email accounts. The cybercrimes team cracked it and downloaded everything. I'm sending it to you now." Price closed his eyes and swayed. He murmured 3 words he would have mocked anyone else for saying. "Thank you, God." Chapter 130. Route 80, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. When they were sure it was safe, the convoy stopped in the middle of the road. Trout nearly collapsed over the wheel. Strange, bad lights were bursting all around him, and he saw darkness trying to close in around the edges of his vision. He took several long breaths and gradually reclaimed himself. Jenny jerked the door open and went running toward the front-end loader. Big Jate DeGroot climbed down, snatched her up, and swung her around. She was like a toy in his massive arms. Their simple joy seemed to put a tiny swatch of color into the day. Behind him, children were snuffling and crying, with fear and, perhaps, with relief. Thumps atop the bus told Trout that Des and the soldiers were climbing down. He hauled himself out of the seat and staggered outside to find Des. She was the first to come down, and she ran to him and wrapped her strong arms around him. She was stained with gunpowder residue and sweat, and Trout could not help kissing her lips and her face over and over again. Then he held her as Gypsy and Boxer climbed down. Trout looked up, waiting for Shortstop and Sam. Waiting. "No," said Des, and there were tears in her eyes. Gypsy leaned her head on Boxer's shoulders, and they sobbed quietly together. He stared at her without understanding what she meant. "What? Wait, Des, where are they? What happened? Didn't you see? Back at the loading bay. See what?" "They died, Billy," she said wretchedly. "Both of them. We climbed up onto the bus, but they didn't have time. Those bastards were all over us. God, Billy, I tried to pull Sam up. I tried." She sobbed brokenly and beat on his chest. It hurt, but he did not care. Sam Imura? Gone? Trout didn't know how to process that. Imura was so tough, so capable. Trout was sure that he was the leading man in his drama, the hero that would save everyone. Gone. Off screen. Simply edited out of the story. Shortstop, too. And Trout realized that he didn't even know the man's name. But Sam, even though the soldier had only been with him for a few hours, he'd become a friend. They trusted him. They knew him. Now he was gone, and Sam was gone. The heroes of the story were gone, and Trout had not even seen it. Somehow that was worse than if he had witnessed it. These men were simply gone from the world, dragged down, consumed. No, worse. Even now, the thing that had been Sam Imura would have risen. What was left of him would have risen. And maybe it had been part of that horde of things that had pursued the convoy. It was too horrible to imagine. It was all too horrible. Who would be the heroes now? He held on to Des, who was frayed and worn and nearly spent. Who was going to ride to the rescue now? While the sun burned through the last of the clouds and painted the landscape with yellow light, Des and Billy clung to each other and wept. Chapter 131. Zabriskie Point Biological Evaluation and Production Station, Death Valley, California. Dick Price and his senior staff sat in a silent line, each of them bent forward, their faces washed to a pale blue by the lights of computer monitors. On each computer, pages of data flashed by. Research notes, developmental procedure records, laboratory tests on animals, formulae, data on the transgenesis of a dozen parasites, dosage tables, biological warfare applications, modifications for use on death row prisoners, a complete medical history of condemned serial murderer Homer Gibbon. It was all there. All of it. 192,000 pages of information. Some of it was in Russian, some in Lithuanian, some in Polish, some in Latin, some in English. Some written in the hieroglyphics of molecular chemistry. Parts of the data were old, scans of handwritten documents dating back to the early 1970s. Other parts were very recent, as new as 5 days ago, which meant that it was 1 day before Homer Gibbon had been given Lucifer 113 instead of the drugs meant to kill him during the court-mandated lethal injection. 2 days before Homer Gibbon woke up in the mortician suite at Hartnip's transition estate. 3 days before the army dropped their fuel air bombs. 4 days before Pittsburgh was overrun and subsequently burned. 5 days before the mass outbreaks that turned Manhattan into a war zone, before Paris was carpet-bombed by the French Air Force, before the Prime Minister of Great Britain ordered all of the bridges spanning the Thames to be blown. 5 days before the Air Force began exploding missiles packed with payloads of raw Reaper over Philadelphia, St. Louis, Detroit, and a dozen other cities. Each bomb was precisely timed to detonate in the path of prevailing winds that would carry it over large portions of the most densely populated areas. That was today. The Reaper mutagen was in the wind now, and soon they'd all know if it would slow Lucifer's spread, or, if God had any mercy left for his children, stop it. Price's team had worked without sleep for days, reading Volker's information, making sense of what was clearly the work of a man who was both brilliant and insane. An actual mad scientist. Price had tried to laugh at that, to find one moment of comic relief in which the irony would vent some of the crushing tension, but he couldn't. When he had tried to laugh, he cried instead. Scott Blair kept calling, over and over and over again, demanding answers, demanding hope. Price's cell rang again, and Price snatched it up with a snarl and very nearly smashed it on the floor. Instead, he pushed the green button with a trembling thumb. Price. There was no immediate reply. Hello? The only thing he heard from the other end of the call was the sound of someone quietly weeping. Mr. Blair? Said Price gently. Scott? He heard a sniff, and then Scott Blair's voice. Price. Jesus Christ, what have you done? What is it? What's wrong? Before Blair could answer, someone screamed. Price and everyone turned away from their line of computers and saw one of the techs, a woman whose name Price couldn't remember in that moment, standing before the bank of TV monitors on the far wall. She wrapped her arms over her head and sank slowly to her knees. She kept screaming. Each of the monitors was set to local news in Philadelphia, St. Louis, Detroit, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Minneapolis, Newark, Omaha, Chicago, and Miami. The cities with the largest populations where there were outbreaks. The cities most heavily hit by Lucifer. The cities over which Reaper missiles had been detonated a handful of hours ago. Until now, there had been a pattern to the outbreaks, a predictable speed. Until now, there had been a splinter of hope buried in Dick Price's soul. Until now. In those areas where Reaper was interacting with Lucifer, the rate of infection had shot up. The degree of murderous ferocity had doubled, tripled. The reporters on the ground were letting the pictures tell the story that they were no longer able, or perhaps willing, to report. The cycle of bite to infection, to death, to reanimation was now so much faster. Too fast. Way too fast. The infection was out of all control, out of any possibility of control. Reaper, inadequately tested, not at all ready for deployment, had been used by the military in a desperate gamble to introduce mutation to a perfect weapon. If something was perfect, then any change would, by definition, create flaws in that perfection. That was the logic, and it was as flawed as the science. Dick Price stared at the screen, and now he understood the last secret in Volker's science. The most important secret. Lucifer, for all its power and aggression, had not been perfect. Better than all generations before it, but far from perfect. Until now. until something allowed, even encouraged it, to mutate further. That one step further until it was, without doubt, perfect. Until Reaper. The phone fell from Price's fingers and shattered on the floor. The woman kept screaming. Everyone else began screaming. It seemed like the only possible response, the only appropriate response. So Dick Price screamed too. Chapter 132, Route 81, near Hungry Mother State Park, southwestern Virginia. The traffic on the highway started off as bad, became worse, became impossible. Des and Trout crouched in the exit well and studied the road through the big windshield. Jake DeGroot was behind the wheel of the first bus, and Des touched his arm and pointed to a small side road blocked by a chain and a sign saying that it was reserved for Forestry Service vehicles only. "There," she said. "Let's get out of this shit. Pull off." "What about the chain?" asked Trout. "Fuck the chain," she said. "Jake, get us out of this shit and I'll deal with the chain." Jake edged the bus that way, but the traffic was jammed tight and moved forward an inch at a time. He hit the horn, got nothing, then jammed his hand down on it in a continuous blare. Still got nothing. Jake shook his head.
"It's too tight. There's not enough room."
Des snarled and jerked the handle that worked the door, snatched up a combat shotgun, and jumped out. There was a big tundra to the right of the bus, blocking their way. Des used her scuffed knuckles to rap on the driver's window. "Hey, buddy, how about pull off so we can get through?" The driver, a big man with a John Deere cap, refused to even look at her. He had snow-white hair and a mean-looking face. The man riding shotgun was equally muscular and twice as ugly. He felt for the pistol in his pocket. Des tapped again, much harder. "Yo, dickhead, you deaf or something?" The driver raised one hand, forefinger extended, and still didn't look at her. "Des," called Trout as he stepped down from the bus. "Be careful." Des ignored him. With a grunt of angry effort, she slammed the shotgun stock into the driver's window. It imploded, showering the driver and the man in the passenger seat with safety glass. That did it. Both doors opened and the two men got out. "The fuck you think you're doing, you cunt?" That was as far as he got before Des Fox hit him across the face with the rifle stock. The blow ripped a bloody gash in the man's jaw and whipped his head around so hard that he spun into the side of the tundra. His forehead hit the open door frame and he dropped right onto his kneecaps. The other man came running around the car, fists raised to smash Des. Billy Trout shoved the barrel of his borrowed pistol into the man's ear. "Touch her, and I'll blow your fucking head off," he said. He heard himself speak the words, felt his mouth say them, and he did not recognize the voice. It was him, and it wasn't. There was such cold honesty there, and in that moment he knew that he would, if he had to, shoot this man. It sickened him to realize that he'd come to this point. But it made him feel stronger, too. For maybe the first time since this thing started. His arm was out straight, the gun in his fist, and it was rock steady. Des turned and saw the gun and then looked at him. Into his eyes. A tiny smile flickered across her lips. There and gone. To the passenger, Des said, "You're going to help your butt buddy into your car, and then you're going to pull off and let us pass. That's not a request. We got a couple of 100 kids in those buses." The man with the gun to his head looked terrified. He licked his lips.
"We have to get out, too. I got a kid at home. Barney has 3 kids. We're just trying to get home."
Des's eyes stayed hard. "All you had to do was pull over and let us pass. The fuck's wrong with you?"
"God, don't touch me,"
begged the man, shrinking back from her.
"Please, don't touch me."
That's when Trout noticed that no one else had gotten out of their cars. With all of the traffic stalled for so long, somebody should have gotten out. There were always people who viewed traffic jams like this as impromptu tailgate parties. But everywhere he looked, everywhere Des looked, the people were hunched inside their cars, the windows up, eyes wide with fear, faces locked into expressions of desperation. Trout almost laughed at the absurdity of it. These people were fleeing in slow motion. Unwilling to get out of their cars, they sat there, waiting for the traffic to move, maybe praying for it to inch forward, and every single one of them terrified at the thought of contact with the people around them. Who was infected? Was the thing on the radio here? Slow motion panic. It was a brand new concept, and it kept turning over and over in Trout's mind until he couldn't help but laugh. Des shot him an angry, worried look. So did the frightened passenger and the people in the closest cars. The only sound on the whole road was the sound of that laugh. And, without support to prop it up, Trout's laughter slowly collapsed, almost into sobs. But he coughed his throat clear and stepped back until he sat down hard on the entrance step of the bus, the pistol hanging limply from his hand. "Billy," ventured Des. "You okay?" He wanted to explain it to her, to see if she'd laugh too, but he didn't. It would be too much like telling a dirty joke in church. "Don't hurt him," was all he said. The passenger looked from Trout to Des. "Move the car," said Des quietly. The man nodded. He picked up his friend and helped him around to the passenger side, belted him in, closed the door, and came around to the driver's side. While he was doing all of that, Des leaned in and used her palm to brush the glass off the seat. She stepped back to let the man slide in behind the wheel.
"I'll lose my place in line,"
he said. Des shook her head. "No, you won't." She backed away from the car and turned in a slow circle to look through windshields at the other drivers. The shotgun was in her hands, barrel sweeping along at the level of headlights and grills. "We're getting off this road," she said, pitching her voice very loud. "This car is going to pull off to let the buses out. Anyone else in the way needs to do the same. Once we're out of here, you can all fill in, but the cars that move get their places back." Trout thought it was one of the most surreal things he'd ever heard. It was like Des was announcing the rules before a schoolyard game of dodgeball. It was all done in an otherwise absolute silence. Des seemed also to realize how absurd it was, and Trout saw different expressions war on her face. Des took a breath and, in her best cop voice, her voice of officialdom and authority, said, "This thing isn't here. No one in these cars is infected. If they were, we'd know it already. You're safe. Your families are safe. Stay in your cars, and when the road clears out, keep heading south. There's a big safety camp in Asheville, North Carolina. Head there. You hear me? Head there." No one said a thing. The windows stayed up. Hands gripped steering wheels. Eyes were fixed on her. "You'll be okay," shouted Des. "Everyone will be okay." Nothing. Not a word. Not a toot of a horn. Not even a nod from the watching people. In a quiet voice, Trout said, "Come on, Des. You did what you could." Behind her, the Tundra revved its engines and began a turn between the tightly packed cars. At first, it looked impossible in the nearly bumper-to-bumper crush. Then the car in front of it rolled forward a couple of feet, and the car behind it did the same. Even with that, it was still tight, but the Tundra began the turn. Des walked past it to the Forest Service Road. She swung the shotgun up, aimed it at the lock, and blew it to shiny metal splinters. The chain fell away, and the sound of the blast echoed along the road. Trout watched people flinch, but otherwise they sat in their eerie, watchful stillness. The shoulder was blocked with cars, too, but with Des calling directions and banging on hoods with the shotgun, the cars shifted by slow, painful inches forward and at angles until after 10 excruciating minutes, there was a lane just big enough for the bus. She waved to Jake, who put it in gear and crept with infinite slowness around the wall of cars on his right. At one point, his bumper scraped the trunk of a VW, but if the driver of the car cared about it, he kept it to himself. Come on, Des said between her teeth as she walked backward, guiding Jake's turn. Trout had gotten out of the bus to watch the other side. The stillness of everything else except the big yellow bus continued to gnaw at his nerves. As the first bus finally cleared the road and rambled through onto the access lane, he realized what it was. Nothing about this fit into any workable scenario for a world he understood. This slow-motion panic, the absolute fear of human contact, the weight of the disaster that pressed down on them, the terror of what might be behind them, all of that was new. Sure, there were corollaries to different elements of it, but as a whole, this was a new thing, a new pattern, and he greatly feared that it was a part of a new world, or perhaps a new world order, a new age of the world. He was sure it was something like that, though his mind rebelled at a specific definition because it all felt too big, too grandiose. Except that it wasn't. It was unprecedented. This was no longer the world he and Des and the children on the bus and the people in these cars knew. Since the release of Lucifer 113, it had become a different world. And in every bad way that mattered, it seemed to him that this new world did not belong to these people, or to any people. This world now belonged to the devil. Maybe it wasn't the biblical devil, he told himself, but he wasn't sure if that distinction even mattered. Lucifer, by any definition, in any form, owned this world now. God help us, he murmured, as the line of buses moved slowly past. He saw the pale faces of terrified children and the blank and vacant eyes of those for whom terror was a minor milestone left behind in a distant country. God help us. But if anyone listened to that prayer, no voice offered even the ghost of a promise to Billy Trout. Chapter 133. Hungry Mother State Park, Southwestern Virginia. They bumped and thumped along the access road for nearly 5 miles until they came to a Forest Service station near the crest of the mountain. There was a small building and a large parking lot with various pieces of heavy equipment, a road grader, flatbeds for hauling down trees, a dump truck piled with gravel. There were no people and no personal cars. Des, Boxer, and Gypsy approached the building, guns up and out, but they found nothing. The door was open, the lights were on, but the station was deserted. Jake led the way, and the buses pulled into the lot and lined up in a row. Somehow Trout found it disturbing that the row was so neat. Each of the adults driving the buses parked in a precise line with the other vehicles. There was something wrong about that, but he couldn't decide what it was. A disconnection from reality, perhaps. He kept it to himself. The last vehicle in the convoy was a flatbed truck they had stolen from a construction site a few miles from Sapphire Foods. Jake had loaded his big bird onto it, and one of the parents helped him and drove the big rig. He parked the rig with the same precision. Maybe they're trying to impose order on chaos, thought Trout. That was probably it, though it felt a bit like tidying the furniture and vacuuming the rugs during a house fire. Trout got off the bus and waited for Des to come out. He watched the parents and teachers begin lining up the kids for trips to the bathroom in the station. Some, those that couldn't wait, were escorted to the tall grass on the far side of the parking lot. Jake, his niece Jenny, and a few of the adults who had guns began fanning out to stand perimeter watch, as if that was something they'd always done, as if that was somehow normal. It is now, he told himself. And that wrenched the knife in his heart another quarter turn. Des came out of the station, looked around for him, then came over, her shoulders slumped, face haggard. "Anything?" he asked. "You were in there a while." "There's a radio," she said. "And?" She simply shook her head. They walked together to the edge of the drop-off. He could barely walk and needed to lean on her for the 70 paces to the bench that offered a beautiful view of the mountains and the sky. On any other day, it would be breathtaking. Down below, the traffic on the highway crawled. "At least it's moving," said Des. "Yeah, there's that." Neither of them could manufacture any convincing optimism. "What did the radio say?" From where they sat, they could hear the sobs of the children and the constant murmur of adult voices as the parents and teachers did everything they could to convince the kids that it was all going to be all right. Trout marveled at how similar a promise sounded to a lie. Or was it all just wishful thinking? Des? She removed the walkie-talkie from her belt and turned up the gain. It babbled at them in a dozen overlapping voices, military and civilian authorities, and even some militia groups whose shortwave signals were breaking into the flow. It was all hysterical, and most of the voices were asking for backup, for relief, for medical attention, for emergency services, for help, for answers. "The radio's the same. No one has any answers," she said. "Most people don't know about Homer or Volker or any of that. All they know is that there's a plague and nobody seems to be able to stop it. There's a lot of bullshit, too. People saying it's the rapture, shit like that. Maybe it's true. Don't start, Billy. Sorry." He bent forward and put his head in his hands. Some of the glass cuts on his scalp and arms hadn't yet been seen to, and he didn't care. Des sat beside him, hollow-eyed and hollow-cheeked, her arms mottled with powder burns, her knuckles as raw and red as her eyes, as she methodically reloaded her pistol and shotgun. Slowly, painfully, Trout raised his head as a flight of 6 fighter jets screamed overhead into the northeast. "Thunderbolts," said Des automatically. "Where do you think they're headed?" "I don't know." She thought about it. "Charleston, maybe?" He nodded. There were more than 100,000 people in Charleston. "Maybe," he corrected himself. He didn't really know if that was true anymore. Des got up and went back to the bus, then returned with a bottle of water, his camera bag, and a map. She set the bag down in front of him. "What's that for?" he asked. "In case you want to use it." He shook his head. They left it there as she opened the map and spread it out over their laps. He studied her blue eyes for a few moments. He saw so many things in those eyes. A fear so deep that it looked like it was cracking the hinges of her sanity. He saw ghosts in her eyes. JT, the dead children, her colleagues and neighbors in Stebbins, the people who had died on the buses. Each of them had left its specter in her mind, polluting her, driving fissures into her. Trout knew with absolute certainty that if Des had to live on this edge for much longer, she was going to break. Those qualities that made her so strong, compassion, her love for the children, her need to save as many as she could, they were each failures waiting to happen. A person cannot be sustained on a diet of their own failure, even if that failure is not their fault. This thing was so big, so vast, that it even consumed people like Sammy Murrah. What hope did Des really have? He almost took her in his arms, almost made the unforgivable error of offering comfort and a shoulder to someone who was right there at the edge of her control. Billy Trout almost made that mistake, but he didn't. Some instinct stopped him even as he began to raise his hands. It was as if J.T. Hammond stood behind him and bent to whisper advice in his ear. J.T., who was more of a father to Des than her real one had been. J.T., who was, very likely, the best person either of them had ever known.
She needs to be strong,
Trout imagined he heard J.T. say.
She needs to take these kids home.
Trout took a breath and let it out.
Asheville, huh?
That's what Sam said.
Okay,
said Trout.
Then it's Asheville.
He did not dare ask what they would do if the infection had reached Asheville. That was a war they could fight on another day, if they had the chance. For now, Asheville was a direction. It was far away from Pittsburgh. It was in the mountains, so maybe that would be something. Trout didn't know and really couldn't make any guesses. It was a direction, a place to head to, and that felt much better than having a place to run from. So much better. They heard a sound like thunder and looked up to see more aircraft, helicopters this time, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Blackhawks and Apaches, and the big cargo choppers, the Chinooks, an armada of the air, powerful, threatening. They filled the sky, flying in waves, heading north, and the clouds seemed to fall back before them, revealing blue skies that offered at least the illusion of promise. Trout wanted to feel hope when he looked at them, but it was slow in coming.
The storm's over,
he said, hoping it meant more than a weather report. Des watched the helicopters fly across the clearing sky.
Will it be enough?
Trout asked. Des shook her head.
I don't know.
After a thoughtful moment, Des nudged the camera bag toward him.
I told you,
You need to file a report, she interrupted.
Why? What's the point?
Des bent and unzipped the case, removed the camera, studied it, and found the record button. She rested a finger over it.
This isn't everywhere yet, she said.
It's spreading, but it isn't everywhere yet.
I know, but you need to tell people, Billy.
You need to keep telling people. You need to tell them everything we know, what it is, how it spreads, how to fight them, everything.
Who's going to listen?
Des shrugged. The drone of the helicopters was fading to a rumor in the sky.
What does it matter? Somebody will.
Maybe if all we do is get the word out to a few, that'll matter. Maybe we'll help some people get through this.
We'll get through it.
Des smiled faintly and nodded.
And it's on us to help whoever we can, however we can.
Everything's going to shit, Billy. We can't be a part of that. We can't be a part of the end. We have to be a part of whatever survives. We have to help people so they know how to fight back. Am I making sense? He stared at her for several seconds, watching her eyes, seeing the lights deep inside the blue, loving her for this.
Yes,
he said.
You're making sense.
After a while, Des took his hand. Then Billy Trout reached out and pulled her gently into his arms, not to comfort her. He kissed her with all the heat and hope and love that he had left inside. The kiss she gave back was scalding. When they stopped, gasping and flushed, Trout murmured,
I love you.
She said, Now, Billy? Really? God, you're such a girl. Laughing out loud, she walked back to the bus. Chapter 134. Sunset Hollow Gated Community, Mariposa County, California. Tom Imura ran, and the night burned around him. The darkness pulsed with the red and blue of police lights. The banshee wail of sirens tore apart the shadows of the California night. The child in his arms screamed and screamed and screamed. Tom clutched little Benny to his chest. He could feel his brother's tiny heart beating like the flutter of dragonfly wings. His own felt like a bass drum being pounded by a madman. Sweat ran down his chest and mixed with the toddler's tears. Tom turned once and saw them. He saw her first. Standing in the window, her arms reaching toward him. She was so pale, so beautiful, like a ghost in a dream. Her dark eyes were wide with terror. Her mouth shaped words that were lost in all the noise. He knew what those words were, though. Just one word, really, said over and over again. Go. Tom ran. He felt like a coward. Tom Imura, the police cadet, tough, top of his class. Tom, the martial artist, with black belts and trophies and certificates. Tom, the fighter. Tom, the coward. Running. "I'm sorry," he yelled. But he was sure Mom didn't hear him. And then he saw the other figure. Paler, larger, infinitely stranger, coming out of the shadows of the bedroom, reaching as Mom had reached, but not reaching for Tom and Benny. Those pale hands reached for her, for Mom, reached for her and dragged her back into darkness. With all of the sirens and gunfire and the pounding of his own heart, Tom could not have heard her screams. He could not have. And yet they echoed in his head. In his arms, Benny kept screaming. Tom screamed too. Pale shapes lurched toward him from the shadows. Some of them were victims, bleeding, eyes wide with shock and incomprehension. Others were them, the things, the monsters, whatever they were. Tom had weapons in his car. His pistol, which he wasn't even allowed to carry yet because he didn't graduate from the police academy until tomorrow, and his stuff from the dojo, his sword, some fighting sticks. Should he risk it? Could he risk it? The car was at the end of the block. He had the keys, but the streets were clogged with emergency vehicles. Even if he got his gear, could he find a way to drive out? No. Buildings were on fire. Fire trucks and crashed cars were like a wall. But the weapons. The weapons! Benny screamed. The monsters shambled after him. "Go," his mother had said. "Take Benny. Keep him safe. Go." Just go. He ran to the parked car. Benny was struggling in his arms, hitting him, fighting to try and get free. Tom held him with one arm, an arm that already ached from carrying his brother, and fished in his pocket for the keys, found them, found the lock, opened the door, popped the trunk. Gun in the glove compartment, ammunition in the trunk, sword in the trunk. Shapes moved toward him. He could hear their moans. He turned a wild eye toward one as it reached for the child Tom carried. Tom shouted in terror. He lashed out with a kick, driving the thing back, splintering its leg. It fell, but it was not hurt. Not in any real sense of being hurt. As soon as it crashed down, it began to crawl toward him. It was unreal. Tom understood that this thing was dead. It was Mr. Harrison from 3 doors down, and it was also a dead thing, a monster. Benny kept screaming. Tom lifted the trunk hood and shoved Benny inside. Then he grabbed his sword. There was no time to remove the trigger lock on the gun. They were coming. They were here. He slammed the hood, trapping the screaming Benny inside the trunk, even as Tom ripped the sword from its sheath. 3 terrible minutes later, Tom unlocked the trunk and opened it. Benny was cowering in the back of the trunk, huddled against Tom's gym bag. Tears and snot were pasted on his face. Benny opened his mouth to scream again, but he stopped. When he saw Tom, he stopped. Tom stood there, the sword held loosely in one hand, the keys in the other. Tom was covered with blood. The sword was covered with blood. The bodies around the car, more than a dozen of them, were covered with blood. Benny screamed. Not because he understood. He was far too young for that. But because the smell of blood reminded him of Dad, of home. Benny wanted his mom. He screamed, and Tom stood there, trembling from head to toe. Tears broke from his eyes and fell in burning silver lines down his face. "I'm sorry, Benny," he said, in a voice that was as broken as the world. Tom tore off his blood-splattered shirt. The t-shirt he wore underneath was stained, but not as badly. Tom shivered as he lifted Benny and held him close. Benny beat at him with tiny fists. "I'm sorry," Tom said again. He gathered up what he could carry, turned, and with Benny in one arm and his sword in his other hand, Tom ran into the night as the world burned around him. Chapter 135. East Compton, Los Angeles, California. "This is Billy Trout, reporting live from the apocalypse." The car sat in the middle of the street, with the radio playing at full blast. All 4 doors were open. The voice on the radio was saying that this was the end of the world. There was no one in the car, no one in the streets, no one in any of the houses or stores. There wasn't a single living soul to hear the reporter's message. It didn't matter, though. They already knew. We hope you've enjoyed Fall of Night, a Macmillan audio production from St. Martin's Press. Text copyright 2014 by Jonathan Mayberry. Production copyright 2014 by Macmillan Audio. All rights reserved.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.